Welcome, everybody. We're grateful to have you join us online or live or later at your convenience for this Provo City Municipal Council meeting. Somebody needs to mute their, okay, there we go. All right, so I'm going to call this meeting to order. It is 5:38 p.m. on Tuesday, April 14th, 2020. Meeting will be conducted entirely via electronic means due to the risks of public gatherings associated with the spread of COVID-19. Governor Gary Herbert has waived the anchor location and certain other requirements for public meetings and noticing, as outlined in Executive Order 2020-01. The meeting will be available to the public for live broadcast and on-demand viewing at youtube.com/Provo City Council. Council requests that attendees help maintain the decorum of the meeting by silencing electronic devices, being respectful to others, and waiting until to speak until called on by myself, the chair. In the current situation where the meeting is being held via Zoom webinar service and broadcast over YouTube, I remind you to turn off your mics when not speaking so as to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to be picked up, recorded, and broadcast for all to hear. I will read off the names of those who are present for this meeting as our roll call, and after that we will have an opening prayer by Bill Fillmore, and then we'll do a Pledge of Allegiance that will be provided by Councilor Shannon Ellsworth, who will recite the pledge by herself while we listen. So currently present for this meeting, we have myself, George Handley, as chair of the City Council.
States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Councilor Ellsworth and Councilor Fillmore. Mr. Strachan, would you like to explain how public comment will work?
Yes, on the screen, you will see a list of items to be discussed tonight. You'll also see some instructions, alternately, I guess, about how to make public comment, how to dial in. Because the City Council is meeting virtually by Zoom webinar, which meeting is being broadcast across YouTube. There are neither council members nor members of the public present at Provo City Hall. This necessitates certain changes in procedure for those members of the community who wish to make public comment during the public comment period or to wish to be heard during the public hearings for those items requiring public hearings. Those items are numbers 1 through 6 of tonight's agenda. To facilitate public comments where designated, we have enabled telephone access. I will share the instructions now, and they will be shown on screen during the public comment portions of the meeting. There are several telephone numbers available to call. These can be found on the YouTube page where the meeting is being broadcast and at provocitycouncil.com. Callers may have to try multiple numbers to get connected. When a caller is connected, they will be required to enter a meeting ID, which is the listed webinar ID, and enter the pound symbol. The phone system will then ask for a personal ID number. Ignore that, simply enter pound at that point. The caller will now enter the meeting as an attendee and will be able to hear the meeting and will be muted. If the caller wishes to speak on the item being discussed, they can press *9 to indicate their desire to comment and then wait to be called upon. Just a warning that if you push *9 a second time, it will be like lowering your hand. So hit *9 once and just wait. Callers will be called upon by the last 4 digits of their listed phone number. Each will then be asked to provide their name and city of residence before making their comments. Each will be given up to 2 minutes to speak. A timer will be posted on screen and the beep should be audible to the caller when their time is up. A required public hearing will be held for certain agenda items prior to the council action. After each such item has been presented, time to comment will be provided for all those who wish to speak. For items that do not require a public hearing, public comment will still be taken following presentation of the item, but that comment period will be limited to 15 minutes. As is the council tradition, 15 minutes have also been set aside for an open public comment period, which is intended to allow comment on matters that do not appear on the agenda.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Strachan. So now is the time, correct? I actually don't see the public. I see the preamble to public comment on the agenda, but I don't. I assume
Yeah, it appears to have been cut off, but yes, now is time for the public comment.
now it's time for public comment. So if there are any members of the public who'd like to make a comment at this time on any matter not on the agendas on the agenda for tonight, please let us know. Now, Mr. Strachan, we have to wait, right, on this?
Yeah, there's a time lag of approximately 30 seconds. So like last time, we'll give it about a minute to see if there's anybody that has their hands raised and needs to be acknowledged and to speak.
Okay. All right, so we will wait. And while we're waiting, I just want to say to the public, we're grateful for your patience during this time. We're, of course, very mindful of all of you during this difficult time. We're grateful for all the work that our public safety officials are doing in this city to help us. And we're grateful for the mayor and for her guidance and for the communication that we have with county and state leaders to assist us as well. We appreciate your patience with this format. But we think it's working quite well, all considered. We would prefer, obviously, to be in person together and hope that you're all doing well. All right, I don't see any comments from the public. So, assuming I have waited long enough, Mr. Strachan, okay, I will go on then we'll go to our first item, which is on our action agenda, an ordinance amending the zone map classification of approximately 0.34 acres of real property generally located at 164 South, 400 West, from residential conservation, RC, to low density residential, LDR, in the Franklin neighborhood. And Aaron Ardmore will present.
Thank you, Council. This was a continued item from 2 weeks ago. Just to reorient you with it, if we can go to the next slide. Here's the property just south of our offices on 400 West between 1st South and 2nd South in the Franklin neighborhood. The next slide. Here's what the site plan would look like. Again, it's 3 single-family detached homes with the LDR zone. And again, next slide. As we zoom in, you have Unit 1 facing the street to match the homes similar in the neighborhood, and then you have a driveway accessing Units 2 and 3 with open yard and parking, individual parking for each unit. And next slide. Here you can see some concepts of the elevations and floor plans that the applicant has proposed. Go ahead. Is that my last slide, probably? So last hearing, we had a few concerns that came up. One of those we've met with Mr. Harding about. Myself and Bill Pepperoni met with Mr. Harding last week on this plan's compliance with the Franklin Neighborhood Plan. The Franklin Neighborhood Plan was adopted previous to this application, and in the future land use plan is where the main issues came up, where the future land use plan is showing R16A on this parcel rather than LDR. As we discussed with Mr. Harding, the plan itself, regardless of the zone, imagines 3 single-family detached homes, which would actually be less than what you would be able to do with the R16A. You could do 4 dwellings there if 2 of them were owner-occupied and they set up the accessory apartments. So in that way, we felt like it's fitting still within the Franklin Neighborhood Plan. The Franklin Neighborhood Plan analyzed these kind of things happening, these infill developments that fit the character of the neighborhood, that improve the neighborhood, bring new housing stock to the Franklin neighborhood. So we feel that this proposal meets many of the goals of the Franklin Neighborhood Plan, as we discussed with Mr. Harding. The other concerns came from the public, mostly having to do with what the LDR zone could bring. So the LDR zone could bring 15 units per acre, which is more than what the applicant has shown in the concept plan. So the developer has provided, I think you all got a copy of this last week, has provided a drafted development agreement proffering a few things. The first thing is that no more than 3 single-family detached homes be built on the parcel. The second, that the front home, Unit 1, and associated garage will face 400 West. And the third, that the developer establishes an HOA and CCNRs that will prohibit rentals. Now, these things were proffered by the developer after hearing concerns at the hearing 2 weeks ago. And we feel that he's made a lot of headway and a lot of effort into trying to resolve concerns with his neighbors and trying to ensure that this product and this project will be something of value for the city and won't be a bait and switch after the zone change is decided upon. So hopefully those details can inform your discussion, and I'm here for any questions that you have.
Thank you, Aaron. Sorry, really quick question. Did you say the development agreement called for 4 or 3? No more than 4, or
no more than 3 single-family detached homes.
I thought that's what I thought, but then I thought I heard you say 4, so I was a little confused. Any questions for Mr. Ardmore?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Ardmore, have restrictions, development agreement restrictions that prohibit rentals, has that been successfully implemented elsewhere in the city?
Not that I'm aware of, Bill. Do you know of any CCNRs that have prevented rentals?
No.
No. We're
So
not
I-
aware of any in the city.
In some cases like the FHA, in some cases like those that you recently approved on South State Street that have FHA financing, they have a limited number of units that can be sold as rentals or used as rentals. But those FHA regulations are the only kind of viable tool I've seen to enforce some specific level of renter versus owner occupancy.
Okay. Seems like the city doesn't really have a means of enforcing that.
Yeah, and I think all the original developer can agree to or commit to is to sell them for owner occupancy. If those people who buy them end up at some point in the future renting them, I don't think we can enforce that.
Gotcha.
Mr.
Thank you.
Sewell, Mr. Sewell, you have a question?
Well, I was going to ask Mr. Jones about that, but I think my question's been answered. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Ardmore before public comment? All right, we'll turn it to public comment. I don't know if we have a neighborhood chair present. I do see a hand raised, phone number ending in 4455. So let me just remind everybody, I'll give you 2 minutes. The 2-minute clock should appear on the screen here. Caller number 4455, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Hey, this is Heidi Green. I'm the house just directly south of the property, and I did comment last time, and I also said in my thoughts, and I've spoken to Dave Harding, so the way I feel is probably not a surprise to you, but I don't know if it goes against policy, but can I ask if you read my email that was sent today, like by a raise of hands, or if you could speak out and say if you've read that email?
I have not read it. I don't know when you send it. This is
Okay. Well, the most recent one was just current. I'll just try to be brief and just outline the basic points. The first thing that's really important to me that I share is that, Rob, I know that you're listening. I don't know if Louise said that you're there, but I want you to know that I care about you. And I'm grateful to this council to hear me. I carry the burden of this because I'm the one the closest. And although the neighbors have expressed the inadequate parking, which is true, it's not Rob's fault, but our street carries a lot of poorly executed parking. There's a talk about what this will do to the rest of our neighborhood, and all those things are true. But for me, it really threatens the reason that I bought this house. And I don't know if emotional plea means anything, but hopefully I can tell you how I feel. It's not possible in a minute to tell you the milestone of buying this house. I'm a single mom raising kids, and it was hard won. But I thought this was a treasure of a house because it was small enough that I could afford. I could update it, and it was an established neighborhood. And Nate has talked about it will look good from the street. But from where I'm at, all 3 of those homes are up to my property. And my property is the size of the front house garage. So yes, I have a teeny home, but I'm carrying that, and it feels like my privacy is lost. My feeling of safety is threatened. And I don't know that I can be confident in sharing my opinion like this matters, but I just want you to think of me when you make this decision. I urge you to come see where we actually live and what this looks like for us. And Rob, I ask you also to be thoughtful of us as you make these decisions and accommodate whenever possible. That's the end of my comments.
Thank you. Another comment from the public. And remind me, Mr. Strachan, do I need to wait? Is there a delay, or can I?
There's a delay, but about 30 seconds. But since you opened it up and there was only one caller with their hand up, I think you can move on.
Okay.
Just to let you know, the applicant is available on the phone.
I see him there.
Okay.
Yeah. So are there questions? So I get we bring it back to, I don't know if, let's see.
Bring it back for council discussion now.
Yeah, okay. So any discussion from the council or questions for the applicant, for Mr. Ardmore? Maybe let's see. I see Mrs. Ellsworth. Go ahead. And then Mr. Harding.
I think this is a really sharp development. It's hardly a development, it's 3 homes. I think it's very sensitive to the context of the area. They've definitely taken some big steps towards a unified aesthetic, and I really appreciate that. I appreciate the thoughtfulness of the developer and that they're willing to work with the city and work with some of the neighbors. And I don't see that this presents a safety threat. To me, I don't see any threats to safety. Seems like there's adequate parking if it meets code. And my only concern would be a development agreement that we can't enforce that would prohibit renters. Because that's, one, I don't like the anti-renter sentiment, and 2, the city can't enforce it, so I don't think it's a strong position for the city. And if we did approve that, it's not enforceable. The neighbors will soon be upset that we're not enforcing it, and it would just be an ongoing consternation for the neighbors who thought that the city council was getting rid of renters when really we have little, if any, authority to do that. So overall, I think it's a great project, but I would recommend removing that clause from the development agreement that would prohibit renters.
Thank you. Mr. Harding?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Ms. Ellsworth that this is a good proposal. I think this is the type of infill that we're looking for in this area. Which is one of the reasons why I voted against the Franklin neighborhood plan when it was first presented, because I did feel like this area should have been zoned LDR to facilitate the projects like this. I was going to email all of you a presentation that was given 4.5 years ago. It was shortly before I joined the council. The Provo City at that time, Community Services. I've already forgotten the name, but yeah, I think it was Community Services, Community Development, hosted a zoning summit and brought in some of the best planners from across the country. Some developers, some local developers, and some regional developers, and it was just an amazing summit. And there's still, I think, like 8 of those presentations that are still on YouTube accessible. The one presentation that I was looking for apparently has been taken down, but in it, the presenter kind of took public officials to task for just a little bit, and kind of gave us a lot of suggestions on what not to do. And one of those things, what not to do, was, if we're going to go through the exercises of planning and putting together documents and whatnot, then we should do our best to follow them. And kind of commented, I think his phrase was, as soon as the ink is dry on the plan, the council often is immediately approving things that don't align with that plan, and really suggested that that's not a good way to operate. That's not a good way to inspire confidence in our residents. It's not a good way to inspire confidence in developers. It's best if we communicate clearly and then stick to our plans. So that's my biggest struggle with this. I did have a very good conversation with Mr. Ardmore and Mr. Pepperoni. We do see this a little bit differently. They feel that even though this proposal doesn't fit with the technical aspects of the zoning that it was put on in the future land use map, that it kind of complies with in the spirit, and it follows a lot of the guiding principles of the neighborhood plan. And I see that, I understand that, but it doesn't meet the requirements of the R16A it does require moving to a different zone, a zone that had been proposed and that that community development changed their recommendation, and the council went along with it at the time. And so I do struggle to approve this rezone to a zone that was specifically considered and rejected in the neighborhood plan. And so to go forward and do that. So that's my biggest difficulty with the current proposal.
All right, thank you. I'd actually like to ask Mr. Slater a question and maybe give him a chance to make a comment. Specifically, I mean, the one question that's already come up specifically is about the rental clause regarding the language in the development agreement. But anything else that Mr. Slater thinks it would be relevant for us to hear, I'd welcome. Mr. Slater, go ahead. You're on.
Okay, yeah, regarding the rental clause, if it's more important that we do whatever we can to enforce that, one other thought has come up, and that is that with this HOA, I live right next door to the subject. I'm north of the subject. And the thought was to include us in the HOA so we could be influential in any decisions made there. And if, for example, two of the new homeowners wanted to have renters and the other one didn't, and we sided with the one that didn't, then it would be a standoff, and it would stall it. It would not allow it. So that's one solution we've considered. There's been a couple other concerns come up that maybe if I have time, I can just address those real quickly. The 2-home versus 3-home concept. I just want to explain real briefly why we went 3 homes. If we go 2 homes, they've got to be larger homes with accessory apartments attached, which means we've got 2 families with children plus 2 apartments with potentially 6 individual tenants, which creates a real high density issue in addition to parking issue on the site, as opposed to 3 families, 6, maybe 7 cars, no renters, no additional. So, the thought being 6 adults as opposed to potentially 10 adults and 10 cars on the subject. That seems to be the number one concern of the neighbors. And then, let's see, there was also, I guess it was, the parking was the other issue, but that's also, I think, part of that encapsulated in that description I just gave. Is there any other questions, or any questions that I could address in addition to that?
I have another question, Mr. Slater, and that's regarding precedent. It's a little bit unusual to do this. I think I see the merits of the proposal, and I think I'm persuaded by the numbers that you've just indicated, that this is not actually higher density in a technical way than what is currently allowed, especially if we approve a development agreement that you've offered and that we would put into effect here. But I guess I'm and maybe you can't speak to this entirely except in your own personal experience, but if we make this allowance in this one case, how many more does that suddenly open up a precedent for other kinds of developments in the area that may not be, that would use this as a precedent, as an excuse to sort of keep the momentum going?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and the fact that the Franklin Neighborhood Plan is a solid plan. I've read all the way through it. Totally in agreement. However, this block, as well as the other blocks along 100 South, are a little bit unique in that we are literally across from the city center. And promoting downtown, as we know, is a critical component of a city's economic growth and strength. And this perimeter, we're literally one house away from the downtown district. So being that close and having the opportunity for the people that live here to walk to work, walk to restaurants, promote the downtown mall concept, does nothing but help the city. And that makes this strip of blocks along 100 South unique to the whole Franklin neighborhood. We are the closest to downtown. So yes, this opens up LDR opportunities, other opportunities. However, you'll see in the neighborhood plan, some areas were already approved for LDR 4 years ago when the plan was implemented. So it's not completely foreign to the neighborhood plan. And the fact that we are so close to downtown, I think it just makes it a unique section or sector of the neighborhood, of Franklin neighborhood.
Ms. Ellsworth, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly clarify that I am not opposed to renters or rentals. I was just arguing that it's not enforceable, but I don't think that it should be a part of the development agreement.
And
Mr.
we
Hart.
could strike that, if that's what the council prefers, we can strike that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harding.
I have a question. I believe it would be for Mr. Jones, if he's read over and is familiar with the development agreement.
I didn't hear the question, whether I've seen it or not.
No, I just, assuming you've seen it, my question is what is being proffered? I believe, if I remember correctly, I just don't have it in front of me, but if I remember how it was described earlier, it is that the third aspect of that is that there's a commitment to create a CCNR that would not allow these units to be rented. Is that?
I actually haven't seen it, so I don't know.
Okay. Do we know where that's at? Is that, do we have a written copy of that agreement? Yeah, Aaron? Or if you want to read it for us, if that's easiest.
Yeah, and I could send you a copy afterwards. I thought the applicant had sent it out. But
I think he did.
Yeah, the three things are: 1, not build more than 3 single-family detached homes on the parcel. 2, that front home, unit 1, be associated garage will face 400 West. And the third one was what you're referencing: establish an HOA and CCNRs that will prohibit rentals.
Okay, so thank you for that, and just your reminder, I have found it in my email. Thank you. So from my understanding of that, the city doesn't need to enforce any of that, other than just ensure that on its creation, an HOA has been established and the CCNRs have been put into place. I don't see anywhere that would necessarily say that we need to enforce, compliance with that, or that just as long that the developer would meet their obligations by the creation of that HOA with the CCNRs. And I assume the other councilors have read through the emails that we've received. I think there was an interesting email that showed the owner occupancy rate for this area over the last 18 or so years. And it does show that the number of owner occupied units has dropped. I think it was from 40 down to 30 at this point. And so at least the previous council spent some time researching and looking at various journals and things that talk about healthy mixtures of demographics and whatnot that make for healthy neighborhoods. And I think it's been stated well in some of those emails that this is not an anti-renter sentiment. It is a question of healthy neighborhoods, and they're concerned about that the owner occupancy rate is low and is continuing to drop, and so they are looking for housing types that will support the owner occupancy. So anyway, I wanted to give some context to that. My personal views, and I know it sounds like I'm arguing both sides of this right now, but my personal views are that these the 3 single-family detached homes as being proposed, I can't imagine them going to rentals or becoming rented out for an extended period of time, probably for at least 10 to 15 years, just based on how other developments in Provo have gone that are kind of this nature. So I think regardless of which way we zone it, I think that this will bring in some long-term residents into this neighborhood. I think this proposal is good. I think that following the neighborhood plan that shows this should be an R16A, could even densify. We could even get more infill with that plan. I think either way, it's going to be a benefit for the city.
Mr. Fillmore. Sorry, you were muted there. Still unmuted, still muted, sorry. Can't seem to unmute you now.
How's that?
There you go.
Okay. Sorry. I have a follow-up to Mr. Harding's question to Brian Jones. Brian, this has to do with the non-renter provision. Typically, if I understand HOA law correctly, any member of an HOA can enforce the CC&Rs. And so if the problem is that there's no one to enforce the CC&Rs, then it seems like the owner's offer here to add his home to the subdivision might solve that. If you turn it into a 4-unit subdivision, and he would have the right to enforce the CC&Rs, and he is in fact bound to the city by the development agreement. Would that work?
Well, I'm not sure that the development agreement binds him to enforce it. It binds him to create it so that the homeowners in the homeowners association had the right to enforce it, but I don't know that there's anything that would bind him to enforce it.
Well, what I'm saying is you could amend the development agreement to obligate him to enforce that covenant as a member of the HOA.
I suppose that's probably possible. I don't think we've ever done that before, in the sense of trying to govern, trying to force someone else to maintain the obligation within a third-party agreement.
Well, the mere fact that we haven't done it before doesn't mean it can't be done. But
Agreed.
I'm just trying to address this issue of this. Otherwise, it's a charade. If we feel that as a policy matter, you want to prohibit renting, then we ought to find a way to enforce that. And I'm just suggesting one creative way to do it. And for all I know, it might be the only way.
Ms. Ellsworth.
I know that in the past, the council has had a really pro-home ownership bias. And for a lot of people, that may not feel anti-renter, but to people who do rent, it does feel anti-renter. So when we create policies that promote explicitly home ownership over renters, it's honestly personally painful, and it doesn't make a lot of policy sense. We're trying to manipulate the market and keep certain types of people outside of our community, outside of certain pockets of our community, outside of our own neighborhoods. And where I'm a renter, I feel really, really discouraged by the idea that we're trying to enforce a certain type of person into a certain type of housing and trying to keep out a certain kind of person from a certain kind of housing. I hope we can move away from those policies.
I would just want to add something to that, and that is that it seems to me that in today's rather fragile moment economically and with regard to real estate, I don't know, even if there were a policy that could enforce something like ownership, I'm not sure that that gives us the kind of flexibility we're going to need in an economy, in a housing market that's going to need some flexibility. And I think the desirability for stability, I mean, I have a brother who lives in Los Angeles who's been renting the same place for 25 years. So renting and stability are not necessarily equal. I think what brings stability to a neighborhood is attractability, or if that's a term I can use. But I think the quality of the housing type that we're talking about here seems to me certainly appealing to a certain kind of dweller, whether it's renter or owner, who is likely to be attracted to that location and want for a reason and for a reason to stay. Anyway, so I think the onus is on the builder, to the developer, to make it as attractive as possible for that purpose. But I think I'm not as worried about. In fact, I would prefer there is no language in the development agreement along those lines in any case, since it seems so difficult to enforce and may, like I say, not be. May actually make it more difficult for people to move in if we're too restrictive in this kind of an economy. Other questions or comments for discussion among the council? Mr. Sewell.
I'd like to support the Franklin Neighborhood Plan. I feel like if we feel like that it needs to be modified, that we should do that first before approving something that's contrary to it. The other thing that I wanted to mention is I was really persuaded by Matt Taylor's argument. He was the one that sent the email outlining how home ownership has declined over the years. In the one block that he referenced, it declined from 43% to 31% from 2000 to a few years ago. And I agree that we don't want to try to enforce home ownership, but particularly in this area, I think that we should encourage it. And it seems to me that the intent of the neighborhood plan and the way to encourage it with the R16 is you're either going to have a lower density, or if you're going to have the higher density with the accessory apartments, that comes with home ownership because that's required. So those are my thoughts.
All right. Do we have any other comments or discussion? Or we have let's see, this is, this requires, this does not require a motion. This is an implied motion. So unless there are any substitute motions, oh wait, I see one more hand up from Ms. Ellsworth. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to move that we approve this, but without the development restriction for an HOA or the rental, or the, what would you say, the negative rental restriction.
Mr. Chair, can I weigh in there?
Yes.
Okay, so just to be, so everyone's clear, we should make sure that we understand that the implied motion doesn't contemplate a development agreement. The ordinance that was drafted did not talk about the development agreement at all. That was submitted afterwards and is not part of what's in front of you. So the implied motion would be to just approve the rezone, end of story. If a member of the council wants the development agreement to be approved, then there needs to be a motion to substitute for this ordinance an alternate version of the ordinance that is intended to approve the development agreement. And I created that version a few minutes ago. I hope John can bring it up on the screen. John, if you didn't get my message in Hangouts, it's an alternate version in OnBase. But again, that would take a motion to substitute that as the actual ordinance that the implied motion would apply to.
Okay.
Just
Very
to clarify, I'll retract my motion.
Mr. Slater is requesting to speak, and he may have something to say with regard to this particular question. So please go ahead, Mr. Slater.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I believe the average non-owner occupancy in the downtown block neighborhoods is around 30%. The Franklin neighborhood is significantly higher than that. So in considering this part of the developer agreement, we weren't necessarily attacking rentals. We were just trying to keep the Franklin area at the median as opposed to above the median average of non-owner occupancy. That's all.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I guess this question, Mr. Harding, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to make the motion that we amend the implied motion to refer to the alternate version that is now currently on our screens. And just to be specific, so that would then request that the mayor negotiate and execute the development agreement as proposed by the applicant.
The mayor's the one that reviews or approves it.
And so, Mr. Harding, just to be clear, so based on your motion, because that's what the draft that's been presented by the developer proposes, it would include the provision about CC&Rs and an HOA that prohibit renting.
That's my my motion, and then if that passes, I imagine there might be another substitute motion that might want to make changes to that. But I would also look to you for some legal advice about how we would go about changing what has been proffered. Anyway, but yes, my motion does include it as written and as requested by or as proffered by the applicant.
Okay.
So if I can make sure I understand this correctly, then we're voting on now, at least the motion. Sorry, there's only been a motion. There hasn't been a second. Is there a second? There is not a second, as far as I can tell. So we're back to.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, Mr. Fillmore, any discussion? I guess I would like to jump in here on the discussion and just say, so if I don't like or feel that this language about renters is necessary in the development agreement, I'm asking Mr. Jones to advise me how to vote. I would want to vote against this so that someone would offer the substitute version, or?
Well, okay, so there's two threshold questions here. So if you're in favor of the development agreement, well, let me back up. If you're not in favor of the development agreement at all, then I would say you should vote against the motion that's just been made. If you're in favor of the development agreement, but not in favor of the renter language, I would suggest a substitute motion to approve the development agreement version of the ordinance, but to withdraw the renter prohibition from the proposed development agreement.
So that would be my recommendation. That would be my motion.
Okay.
To withdraw the language about renter prohibition. I just think it's too problematic. I don't think it's the right time, and I don't again, I think the issue is stability. It's not whether people are owning or renting. And I think the agreement and the proposal are strong, attractive proposals that will bring stability to the neighborhood on their own terms.
I will second that motion on the basis that if no sense having a provision in the agreement that is unenforceable.
Would
Ms.
this
Ellsworth.
would this motion still require an HOA?
We may have to refer back to Aaron on that since I don't have it in front of me, but I don't believe so. From what I understood from what Aaron read, I think that what would happen based on this motion is that the first two proffers within the development agreement would still be there, but the third would be removed.
Okay, so we wouldn't have an HOA to regulate rentals or not.
Correct. That's my understanding of the motion.
Gotcha.
Mr. Harding.
Are we okay to, I mean, how would we, it seems like we at least need to consider how we would move forward with that, meaning we have a proffer from a developer, and I imagine, you know, we instruct the mayor to negotiate, and we would like her to negotiate for the first 2 points that were proffered and not the third point, or it sounds like we're messing with someone else's proffer, and that, you know,
well,
that's my concern.
I mean, to an extent we are, but all we're doing is removing a requirement, right? I mean, it doesn't hurt them to not be required to do something that they offered to be required to do.
And he has already expressed willingness to remove it, so.
Okay, if you're good with that, Brian, then or Mr. Jones, I am as well.
All right. So I'll call for a vote on the substitute motion. Seems like there were two substitute motions, but I guess you all catch the drift, right? So we're voting on whether or not we, oh, brother. Mr. Jones, would you just explain?
Let me do that, because I want to remind everybody that by this vote, you won't actually be approving the rezone. This is going to be a two-step process. So right now, you are voting on whether or not to substitute for the ordinance that was previously in your materials a version of the ordinance that approves a development agreement as proffered by the applicant, but without the language about rentals and the HOA. If that motion passes, then you will need to vote on the implied motion to actually approve that ordinance.
All right. With that, I'll call for a vote on the substitute motion. Mr. Harding? I'm just doing a roll call. Mr. Harding?
No.
Mr. Fillmore?
Yay.
Mr. Hoban?
Yes.
Mr. Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Sewell?
No.
Ms. Ellsworth?
Yes.
And I will vote yes. So I think I added, let's see, did I might have lost count somewhere in there. I heard, I heard at least 2 no's, correct? Was there a third? I think there were 2. So it was Mr. Harding and Mr. Sewell. Am I correct? Okay.
Yes.
So all those, the other 5 were in favor. Okay, so then, Mr. Jones, you're saying now we go back to the rezone question?
Yes, now you take a vote on the implied motion, but the implied motion now applies to this new version of the ordinance that requires a development agreement.
All right, so I'll call for a vote on the implied motion. I'll start again with, sorry, I'm just doing this on, you guys keep shifting order in my visual column here. Mr. Sewell?
No.
Mr. Fillmore?
Yes.
Mr. Hoban? Mr. Hoban, we didn't hear you.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
It's all right. Mr. Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Harding?
No.
Ms. Ellsworth?
Yes.
And I will vote yes. So again, that is 5-2 with Mr. Harding and Mr. Sewell opposed.
Okay. All right, we will move on to item number 2, an ordinance amending Provo City Code to establish a critical hillside overlay zone, citywide application. This will be presented by Mr. Brandon Larson, Provo City Planner. We welcome you, Mr. Larson, and go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for letting me be here tonight to speak with you. We have a couple of, a couple of things related to this these hillside requirements that we'll talk about tonight. So the first one is a text amendment, and if you could advance to the next, I think the next 2 slides would probably be fine. Thank you. So, so what's proposed is a text amendment. It would be a new chapter in Title 14 of the City Code. These are proposed hillside requirements. This is essentially a new overlay zone called the Critical Hillside Overlay Zone. The intent here is to establish some new requirements to protect the hillside area of Provo City and consider things as consider aesthetics and the ecology of the hillside area. As we've gone through this, we've looked at other jurisdictions and what they have by way of hillside requirements. Salt Lake County seems to have kind of perhaps the best example of a good hillside ordinance. We've reviewed their ordinance. We've looked at Park City, Summit County, and a few others, and so that has kind of guided some of the thinking that's gone into this. I guess I want to start off, or as we get started, wanted to point out that the Critical Hillside Overlay Zone, or the CH Zone, is not it's not precluding development in the boundaries of the CH Zone, which we'll talk about here a little later. Those properties in that CH Zone will still be able to develop. They'll just have some additional requirements. Overlay zone, the way that works is you've got the underlying zoning. Nobody's underlying zoning is proposed to be changed by this proposal, but what we're proposing is to overlay on top of the existing zoning some additional requirements. And so in saying that, permitted uses is an important part of zoning. Nobody's permitted uses are going to change. They're governed by the underlying zone. So what I am going to do now, and I'll kind of give you a bird's eye view of this application. So some of the points, some of the higher level requirements in this new proposed chapter. So one of the first things we come to is the limits of disturbance. Everybody's going to anybody if this is adopted, then anybody who develops is going to need to identify limits of disturbance on their development plans. Limits of disturbance are proposed. The requirements are such that they would only allow 40% of a property to be within that area that could be developed. The rest of it would remain in open space. One of the thoughts here is to try to keep the open feel of the foothills, and so we want to keep a good portion of property open. So development plans would need to show the limits of disturbance. Could you go to the next slide? And I would say, along with limits of disturbance, a couple of other points before I move on to the next section there. Limits of disturbance, they...
I'm not the city council member for District 4.
I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback.
I just muted it. I don't
know. Sorry about that. So one of the things I'd want to point out with that is, yes, there is a large portion of a property that cannot be developed roughly 60%, 40% can be developed. Out in that undeveloped area, you can still do utilities. Utilities can still be constructed in that outside the limits of development. And so wanted to also move on to slope protection requirements. So slope protection requirements, important point, one of the more important points in this ordinance is the protection of slopes. With that, I do want to say that this is an ordinance that considers things ecologically, things aesthetically, not so much engineering. It's certainly related to engineering requirements, but we have a Title 15 that has a lot of engineering standards in there. And so this isn't meant to replace the hillside requirements in Title 15. It's just meant to work with it. And so with slope protection requirements, these are more kind of aesthetic in nature rather than saying, rather than prescribing some engineering, additional engineering standards. So one of the important points with slope protection is setting development off the ridge lines. One of the we've proposed that development be set off the ridge line 100 feet. Ridge lines are defined in the text along with the term ridge. I want to be clear because this was a point that that was brought up in Planning Commission. Ridge lines, the way this ordinance has been brought to you, does not include benches. So we're not saying you can't develop on a bench, but we are saying that development on top of a ridge line would be prohibited. So the slope protection requirements are meant to try to have development blend in with the nature, with the natural surroundings, and not to detract from the natural surroundings. And that's kind of an important point in all of this, is try to have development blend with the natural surroundings rather than to detract from it. And so as we move down to detention basins are a good example of one of those things that are common in development, but we wanted to make sure that we brought to you a proposal that has detention basins that kind of blend with nature, rather than having a kind of your grassy bowl that you see in a lot of subdivisions. We wanted to propose something that would look more like a pond in a natural setting, or a basin in a natural setting. One of the things that the Planning Commission brought up is they really one of the points was brought up that was in that meeting was to have natural vegetation, especially fire resistant natural vegetation, be associated with these debris basins. And so one of the things that was added by the Planning Commission was that the vegetation be fire resistant and drought tolerant. Going along with kind of that theme of trying to have development work with nature rather than against it, detract from it, streets, the proposal would be for streets to follow natural contours and to not create undue and to not have streets make undue impacts on the environment. There'd be some limitation on how much land could be disturbed. I'm not saying, what I mean by that is, like, when you look at the cross section of a road, I'm not saying that there'd be a limit on how much land could be devoted to roads, but like when you're going through a certain section, there would be a limit on how much land you could disturb in constructing roads. Next slide. Trail and trailhead dedications. Foothills are, let me say it this way, trails are an important part of the foothills. We wanted to consider trails in this application. We are concerned we don't want to put the city, give the city something that might bringing up takings issues. And so we haven't put forward an ordinance that would require trail dedication, but we have put forward an application that certainly encourages trail dedications, or this construction of trails, and encourages the dedication of trails to the city. We do that by not only through trails, but also trailhead dedications. A trailhead with a paved parking lot. There's provisions that if a developer construct and dedicate trails or trailheads to the city, that they can get a density bonus for their development. Up to 10% is what we're proposing. Another important feature of this application is tree and vegetation protection. I've noted that we have a definition section. Significant trees are defined there, 6-inch caliper. Also, a group of smaller trees would also be considered significant trees. We want to make sure those are preserved. And so not only significant trees, but just the natural vegetation in the foothills. We've provided requirements that would require the protection of the significant trees and the vegetation. We've also considered urban wildland interface requirements in drafting this section. Urban wildland interface, or the wildland urban interface, is a collection of fire requirements that come from the state. We want to be sensitive to fire. Obviously, this is an area that is sensitive to fire, and we want to make sure that we're proposing something that's not going to add to the fire concerns in the foothills. And so one of the important, I think these requirements actually help kind of bridge a gap, kind of bring fire requirements and planning together pretty well. There would be an applicant would have to bring a vegetation plan. That vegetation plan would have to be approved by the fire marshal. They'd get a chance to look at it, make sure that the vegetation was, in harmony with the urban wildland interface requirements. Two of the required documents related to tree and vegetation protection. The first one is a revegetation, tree establishment, and land reclamation plan. Essentially what that is if a developer starts a development process, he's going to have to identify, he's going to have to establish a plan for revegetating the disturbed land. A tree and vegetation protection plan, he's going to have to put forward a plan, and both of these plans would have to be stamped and signed by an engineer and a landscape architect. And so back to the tree vegetation protection plan, that would identify the vegetation that would be protected in the development process. One of the more important parts of this hillside ordinance would be design standards. Those design standards are meant to help buildings and landscaping work with nature. Buildings would be designed to follow natural contours and blend with the natural settings. Landscaping would incorporate natural features. Parks and utilities would be screened, and just the idea that we want to keep the foothills aesthetically pleasing. And for instance, fencing. The proposal for fencing in this area would be to keep it open, thus preventing the blocking of views of the foothills. There's other important parts, and I've just kind of briefly touched on some of or highlighted some of the important parts of the overlay zone. There's cluster requirements, and I know we've talked a little bit about that, and maybe trying to bolster that to more strongly encourage or require clustering of developments. Right now, the clustering requirements basically say that if you want to cluster, these are the requirements that you're going to follow. You're going to have to get an engineer to show that you're going to put forward a better product than what the regular requirements would produce. So that's currently how we have it. It's just basically an allowance for it. We certainly are not opposed to the idea of putting in some stronger language to require clustering in some instances. And with that, I'll just I guess I've kind of given you a high level view of the ordinance, and now ask you for what comments or questions you have on this ordinance. So.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Any questions for Mr. Larson? Okay, we discussed this at some length earlier today. We'll see if there's any questions from the public. Do I need to wait a full minute, Mr. Strachan, or no?
Yeah, we'll give it a minute, but so far nobody has signaled that they're interested in talking. So let's just give it another 45 seconds here. Or thereabouts.
Yeah, well, while we're waiting, we have received emails. And of course, as we've explained a couple of times already to the public, if the call-in feature is a little bit daunting, you know, as always, we welcome individuals reaching out to us either collectively or individually as a council to discuss their concerns.
Yeah. And Mr. Chair, one of the things I would recommend too is we often will get emails on council day. So just reminded the public that if you get them to us before council day, meeting day, you have a better chance of reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, I meant to say something to Heidi Green earlier to explain that the only reason I hadn't seen her emails is that we've been in meetings all day, and so it's sometimes challenging to try to catch up on things as they're coming in. Although I try sometimes without getting too distracted, but it's very difficult. All right.
George, this is the first hearing, and I would conclude that nobody wanted to comment.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. All right. So we'll bring it back to the council for council discussion. I'd like to ask Mr. Larson a question, maybe just for the benefit. You and I have talked about it before, but for the benefit of the public, there are areas of this, especially of the Northeast foothills. I know this applies to a lot more than just the Northeast, but areas up there that are undeveloped at present, and there are pre-existing roads that have been there for a long time, and trails and so on that have been used, and some of which are formal trails that are on maps, like the Bonneville Shoreline Trail. There are others that may have been, you know, sort of makeshift developed over time. What is the status of those trails and those roads within a proposal for a development, for example, that might come forward? To what degree will the city be able to rely on those areas to remain open to public access?
Thank you. That's a good question. We have included requirements to require. If a developer comes in, obviously there's going to be plats and plans that will need to be prepared. Some of those will need to be recorded. We have put a requirement in here that those public accesses would have to be identified and located on plans and plats. And plats, again, of course, would be recorded. So that'd give the public increased, that'd give them some additional ways of identifying and being able to discover where there are public accesses. We've also included a requirement in here that any public accesses that are existing, legal public accesses, would have to be kept open, and any development that could potentially block a public access through their development, they'd have to actually keep that access open in their development activities, keep it open permanently. So.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Other questions for Mr. Larson? Mr. Harding.
I just say that we had a good conversation, good discussion in our work meeting. I believe I heard that there was an intent for the committee to get back together and talk about some small tweaks, and also heard just potentially some changes. So I look forward to seeing what that looks like at our meeting next week, and hopefully resolve it there.
Thank you.
If I could maybe just address that, Mr. Harding, I think I was the one who maybe explained that. That's only necessary if there are suggestions for revision. In other words, if anyone, because this is the first time this has been heard, if any one of the council feels it necessary to delay, then it's automatic, or continue, then it's automatically continued. Of course, if that is the feeling of any council member, it would be helpful to the committee to know what the concerns are specifically that would need to be addressed or tweaked, so that unless if there's no feedback and there's no concerns, then obviously continuance isn't necessary. Anyway, I think you understand that. I'm just maybe explaining that for the sake of everyone concerned here. Ms. Ellsworth has a hand up.
Yeah, I do have some concerns. I discussed them earlier in the work meeting and via email. And so I'm sure that staff will consider those and incorporate them where feasible and desirable. Just to reiterate, some of those questions were around retaining walls and the, how do you say, kind of mounds or knolls of dirt that support power lines and power pole infrastructure that is significantly above grade. So yeah, those are some of the concerns that I have. I hope they'll be integrated or at least responded to by staff over the next week, but I look forward to approving this next week.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Ellsworth. Mr. Sewell.
Just in the last 2 days, I've run across several property owners who weren't aware of this, that will be affected by it. And I'd like to propose, one of them, today I was already able to put it in contact with Bill, and they had a very productive discussion, I think. So I'd just like to propose that we ask staff to reach out to those folks, see what questions or concerns they might have, and see if that leads to anything that we might want to consider changing.
Okay, very good.
Mr. Harding.
And I agree with what the last couple councilors have said, and I just wanted to mention that the clustering, as I discussed with you personally earlier, and we discussed in the work meeting, that's where my main concern is, and hope that either staff or the committee can consider those concerns.
Very good.
Mr. Larson, it sounds like it's all but certain that we're going to continue this then for another week. We normally meet as a Foothills committee on Tuesday morning. I'm wondering if, at least as a committee, if we can get suggestions for revisions to you, some of which maybe the vast majority of which are have already been given to you. If the subcommittee could be looking at a draft by the latter part of this week, I think that would be advantageous, so that we're not doing things last minute on Tuesday morning.
You bet. Yeah, we can get that revised and over to the Foothill Committee by the end of the week.
Okay.
So if we could do that by the end of the week, then perhaps get input from the committee on Monday, or hear your feedback anyway on those changes on Monday, and we could make any other changes necessary before the end of the day, Monday. Does that work?
Yeah, that would be ideal. Yeah. All right. Any other comments or concerns from the council? If you do have specific suggestions and you haven't sent them, please do so to Brandon as soon as possible, and we'll work on that quickly. Appreciate all your effort. I've said this many times, Brandon, but you've done a terrific job. And I said this earlier today. I want to say it again for anybody who might be listening, that this is just one piece of a larger puzzle that I think needs to be completed for us to be really comprehensive and forward-thinking in terms of what our relationship as a city is with our foothills and many of the territories that go well beyond this particular ordinance up Provo Canyon and up South Fork Canyon. And that's a longer conversation that we intend to have as we move forward, because I think there's a need for that, and we'll be able to move into that next phase as soon as we manage to complete this particular portion of it. So, all right. So I guess we do not need to do anything, right? We just the item has been automatically continued. And we'll move on to the zone map classification. This is item number 3. This is deeply related, obviously, and may not need as much conversation, but I don't know. We'll find out. This is regarding the zone map classification of multiple East Bench properties to include them in the Critical Hillside Overlay Zone. And this is also presented by Brandon Larson.
Very good. If you could advance to the next slide, thank you. Okay, so the CH zone boundaries a little bit difficult to figure out how to bring something to you on this. It's in consulting with other jurisdictions like Salt Lake County, they had Wasatch Boulevard, a pretty good linear street to use as a west boundary for theirs. We didn't have anything like that in the city to use. So what we tried to identify, we wanted to be objective in trying to apply this proposed zone. And so we found elevation, we tried to use an elevation. 4875 is an important elevation in the city for providing water. That is an elevation at which the city can, at that elevation, there's certain parts of the city where they can only provide water up to that elevation. So we chose to use that as one boundary, and then the other boundary is basically a divide between public and private land. We tried to identify every private parcel that is in Provo City that lied kind of on the eastern boundary of this area, this foothills area that we were looking at. We tried to look at, okay, here's where the development ends, and then east of that, let's try to determine if there's any other private parcels. And so we identified all of those. The only parcels that we've included all of those private parcels in this CH zone. We didn't include the BYU parcels. They were an exception. And there is one other parcel, now that I think about it, up on the Squaw Peak Road. There's a small piece adjacent to the Springdale development in Utah County that was also not included, but it's kind of a ways from the foothills. So we used those two lines, and basically anything between those lines were included in the CH zone. And then we took this to the Planning Commission, and they had another recommendation that they identified a portion, some land on the south end of they identified areas on the south end of the city that had a good slope to them, but hadn't been included. And so we updated this plan or this map amendment to include those cities or those properties in the city in this plan. So I also note one deviation from using those two, the 4875 elevation and the private public private public line there, was the use of elevation 4750 through the state hospital property. The reason we used that was because that state hospital property actually runs really long east to west, and it went up the mountainside quite a ways, and we were worried that if we included the entirety of that parcel, we would be including some pretty undevelopable land in the CH zone. So we did not include all of that parcel. So by the time we went through the planning commission, we ended up with a proposal that included about 2,060 acres of city land in this, again, for inclusion in the CH zone. Next slide, please. This next slide's kind of a bird's eye view of the CH zone. It's you can see. Let me describe a couple of important things on this. So the blue area is the CH zone. The dark blue area, kind of outlined in a pinkish purple color there. It's definitely more pronounced on the north, lesser land on the south. And that's just how it panned out when we worked out with using that elevation 4875 and the private public line there. I want to point out that the kind of bright light bluish green line there, that's the elevation 4875, and you can see it running north to south through the foothills there. One thing that was a challenge, and I noted this earlier, originally we were going to try to use 4875 as the western boundary of the zone and use the private public divide there for the eastern boundary, but towards the south end of the city, they start going, they kind of cross over each other. And so that didn't work to say, okay, this is going to be the east and the west boundary. It's just based on the way it worked out, we just said anything between those lines, we would propose inclusion in the CH zone. And then you can see the yellow outlined area on the southern portion of the city, kind of starts on the north end near the Provo Temple and runs south towards the zone ends just north of Evans pit there, gravel pit. So if you can go to the next slide, we'll get a little bit closer view. There's the north end with the roads. You can get a better look to see where this lies on the north end of the city. And then if you can go to the next slide, you'll get a look at the south end. Again, the south end, that yellow outlined area, that was added at the request of the Planning Commission. There, in using that 4875 and the private public line, there were some properties that did have a slope to them that were not originally included, and so they've been included now. I have the remainder of these slides are kind of just snapshots of some Google Earth images I took, and so we'll get a little bit better view. There's a bird's eye view with kind of the relief from the mountains there. And if you can go to the next slide, what I'm going to do is just start on the north end of the city and just go down, and you can get a better look at each one of about 5 or 6 areas of the city. And so this area here is the very north end of the CH zone. Any of the land around it, you can see that there's some portions of the CH zone, or there's not all portions of the CH zone are contiguous. And the reason why is because you've got some Orem City land, which I believe is in this area here. And you've got the rest of this open land around here is county land. It's all in the county's jurisdiction. So with us not having jurisdiction on these properties, we didn't include them. As we talked earlier today, there likely will be some additional efforts to address what to do with some of these lands if and when they come into the city. If you go to the next slide. This is looking at land just east of like Canyon Road, Pay Ranch area. You can see I think we talked about this earlier, there's the Budge property, and perhaps I think Gillespie may be in there. So this land is, again, just surrounded by Utah County jurisdiction. And if you can go to the next slide, I'll go to the Sherwood Hills area. As we and again, as you look at this, look at these slides, you can see the 4875 and how it runs runs on the west side of this area. And I noted this earlier. There are some parcels. I said that we tried to include all the private parcels that we could identify, and the reason why we did that was because we wanted, again, the CH zone isn't we're not trying to limit development. That's not the proposal here. We're just adding some additional aesthetic requirements and things like that, ecological things to preserve, requirements to preserve the ecology of the area. And so in doing that, there were some private lands that were excluded, but again, they were in county jurisdiction, so we couldn't do anything with them. But we have included all the private parcels that we could identify, so that there wouldn't be any. So we wouldn't be taking anybody's ability that had already developed property. We didn't want to take away their ability to utilize their property. There may be an additional effort in the future to identify how to address the land on the east of this zone. But for now, we're just trying to preserve. We're trying to include all the private land and continue that ability to develop. If you go to the next slide, this is the Indian Hills and Rock Canyon area. On the south end of the area, you can see how you've got you've got blew up the hill a ways. That was a private parcel, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't exclude any private property owner from being able to develop in the future. So you can go to the next slide. So this is where we start seeing that added area recommended by the Planning Commission. At North Tip is right by the Provo Temple, and it runs south and along some areas, again, with a pretty good slope to it. This runs to about the Seven Peaks, runs south to about the Seven Peaks Utah State Hospital area. And if you can go to the next slide, we'll get a look at the hospital area and Seven Peaks. This is the area, and I told you that those two lines, this 4875 and that private public line, they start kind of crossing over each other in this area. And so if we hadn't included all the land between those two lines, or if I say it a different way, if we had just said, hey, 4875, you're west, and private public, you're the east line, we would have probably fizzled out at this point, and the CH zone would have ended in this area on the south, or it would have ended on this southern portion of the city. Would have left out, I think, some pretty important portions of hillside area in the city. So if you can go to the next slide, we're getting towards the southern end of the city. There originally, we didn't have any of this important hillside area. That, as noted earlier, there is a lot of developable land right through this area that eventually someday probably will be developed, and I think it's important that we that they be subject to those hillside provisions, so that we can not only look out for the ecology of the foothills, but also offer the citizens an aesthetically pleasing, offer them aesthetically pleasing development on the hillsides, and kind of leave it with a little bit of an open feel. And if you can go to the next slide, this is the end here. This is Jamie Evans gravel pit, I believe, is down here, county Public Works. So this line right here follows the Provo City boundary. The rest of this, I think, is this portion here. I believe is a good portion of this is not in the city. But those are the boundaries, and that's these boundaries are based on discussions not only with staff but also with Public Works, with the Hillside Protection Committee, Planning Commission input from the public. So we feel like we've tried to put forward a good. We've tried to put forward boundaries that we think are workable, that will allow for preservation and protection of the foothills. And I failed to mention this in the last item, but there was some concern from the public about having these standards, these new requirements, be applicable to existing lots. And so we, in that text, we carved out a couple of exceptions to allow for parcels and lots that have been developed prior to this, the effective date of this ordinance. They wouldn't be subject to these requirements. There was we received some pretty strong feedback from some members of the public. So and as you look at these boundaries, just keep that in mind. These, for instance, here you can see there's some lots in here. They wouldn't be subject to these requirements. So we're looking more at these open areas up on the east of the already developed lands. And so anyway, I thought that'd be an important point to note as you consider this.
All right, thank you, Brandon. Any questions for Brandon? Mr. Hoban. Mr. Hoban.
Sorry, I had to get unmuted. Hey, Brandon, thanks for the presentation and for all the work you guys have all put into this. These open areas that are still, I don't know, we call them developable, I guess. Do we know how many property owners this will impact? I've gotten a few emails from property owners saying, hey, this is my land and now I've been paying taxes on it and now I can't develop it, or, similar messages. Yeah. Do we know about how many property owners this is going to impact on these open spaces?
Prior in the open spaces, there will be several property owners that will be impacted. I'm not sure on the number, but there are multiple property owners that will be impacted. And I guess I'd want to hit home the point that as I started, at the start of my presentation on the first item, that the idea isn't here to limit development. It's certainly, I think that we've offered requirements that will still allow development, very much allow development. It's just going to be subject to some additional design requirements and some additional considerations like the preservation of trees and things like that will offer the city some more attractive and aesthetically pleasing development on the hillside while keeping it open for future generations. But no, I think that what we're offering here is a good thing for the city, and it's going to have an impact on some citizens. It's not going to keep them from developing it, but they're going to have some additional requirements to deal with. That's the very nature of an overlay zone. It's adding additional requirements to existing ones.
This might not be possible, but I know that there are some restrictions that would keep pieces of the land from being developed, whether it be, too much of a slope, or it's on a ridge line, or
right,
it's, too close to a river, whatever that might be.
Sure.
I'd be curious, if you took all the land that's included in this, the open space, and you kind of put a red mark through the areas where you wouldn't be able to develop because of that, do we know what that would look like? I know that that's totally to even ask you for a gut feel of what percentage of the open space would be undevelopable, I know is probably, you could never give me a number, I guess, but any idea, how much land percent, or, how much of this land would be excluded because of some of the requirements we put on there? I guess I'm looking for maybe an answer to a response to some of these people to say, yes, I understand there are restrictions being placed on it, but you can still develop 90% of your land or whatever. I don't know. That might be too big of an ask, but it's just something that's crossed my mind.
The most efficient way for us to answer that would be to know which property owners you're referring to. And then the information we already have that would be most informative is the city's topographic maps that show any areas that are 30% slope or over. They're shown in a red color. And that's existing regulation in Title 15 that says you can't impact those, or there are only limited ways that you can impact those. That's the biggest thing that would prohibit somebody or inhibit somebody from being able to develop their property. And that's existing code in Title 15. What this ordinance is not adding to that. This ordinance is not taking land that was on the table for development yesterday off the table today. But we could address those specific property owners with them based on maps we already have, if we knew who they were and we could contact them.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll reach out or forward them over to you.
Thank
you. It's good to hear, though, that the 30% slope, because I was thinking that probably would be the biggest thing that would have an impact. But it sounds like if that's already existing, then a lot of these requirements, like you said, aren't going to restrict development, just force it to be done in a different way or a more responsible way and such. Okay, thank you.
And that was Bill Pepperoni, slightly off camera there. There he is. Okay, any other questions for Mr. Larson? If not, I'll see if we have not seen any hands up from the public for public comment. So
let's just give them a minute.
Okay.
We actually have 4 call-in listeners, and they would need to hit *9 if they want to call.
Yeah.
Talk.
While we're waiting, Mr. Jones, if this item is obviously a separate item, but does it have to be, if the other item's been continued, does this one have to be? Or, I mean, it may very likely be the more logical thing to continue it as well, but.
It needs to be continued because this ordinance is to apply a zone to the map that you haven't yet created. So it needs to be continued since the other one was.
Okay, I'll bring it back to the council for any additional discussion. It's going to be continued then until next week. Seeing no questions or comments, I'll just ask you all to send any additional comments to Mr. Larson. And I would say, like as with the last item, there have been a number of emails that have come in today. So take a look at those, and if there are any questions or matters that are good to be brought up with Mr. Larson, that would be helpful. I do think of one really quickly that I meant to mention earlier, and we can talk about this in the ensuing week, but the concern was about the Smith Ditch and about whether or not the rights that are associated with that ditch would be impacted in any way. I've assumed that they wouldn't be, but
I'm not aware of any impacts. I'm not aware. I guess I truly don't know if any of that Smith Ditch is in the city. This again isn't bringing it, wouldn't impact anything that lies outside of the city. Again, there was no intent in drafting this to impact the Smith Ditch, and I'm aware of no impacts.
Yeah. Okay. I can follow up with you on that. All right. Well, thank you all. We'll move on then to item number 4. which is an ordinance amending the Provo City General Plan relating to the Transportation Master Plan with citywide application. And this will be presented by Shane Winters, our Provo City Planner. Is Mr. Winters available, or is he muted? I don't actually see him on our list.
I was asleep
Oh,
at the wheel here. He's just been
he's-
elevated.
Go ahead, Mr. Winters. I see you calling.
All right, can you hear me, Cal?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right, can you hear me, council members?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, council members. As this was continued from our March 17th council meeting, the update to the general plan for the transportation master plan. I appreciate the last month's dialogue that we've had with council members and some of the feedback and discussions that we've had. I just want to give again a quick synopsis of where we are at to date, so that you understand of the substantial amount of effort that has went and been involved to getting to this point where we're at today. So we started this process again 2 years ago, over 2 years ago. Our anticipation that when we first started this, that we would have this completed in about a year's time frame. But we understand with some of the good feedback and public open houses and various committees, some of the dialogue that we had, that we have taken a lot of consideration into a lot of comments, and have went through a fairly substantial process. And some of those processes include a complete revision to our street typical sections. We've reduced our typical section street widths on our typical sections while still preserving the necessity of right-of-way. Along with that, we've already adopted portions of this master plan, which includes the typical sections, but also includes the first phase of the capital facilities plan, and the working through the impact fee analysis on transportation and getting those updated, the impact fees updated. We've also, again, had 3 open houses and worked extensively with the community to address their concerns, worked with specific community chairs to address their concerns specific to their communities and some of their concerns. We've had 9 TMAC meetings where we've went through a similar process as we have with the council on getting their comments, getting their feedback, and making sure that we best address some of their concerns that they had. And again, we've had, I think we're up to at least 9 city council meetings and work sessions on trying to address some of the council's concerns and some of the feedback that we've had there. I just do want to reiterate that we do have, as we went through this process, we've had the recommendation from TMAC committee, and we appreciate their hard work. We also have a positive recommendation from the Planning Commission, as we really worked hard with them to make sure that we addressed anything that they felt was of concern. So where we are at this point, I think we've identified, as we've worked with the council, and maybe Vern, who's on here as well, can maybe chime in if there's anything else I'm missing. But it seems that we've come to the point where we kind of identified, at least I seem to identify four concerns, substantial concerns, and it seems like that what we've been working through, those 4 concerns that we had were 2 project related items. One was 2230 North, And I think we've reached a good place with the community, the Pleasant View community, and the process that we were implementing on moving forward and resolving their concerns there. The second, of course, has been a topic for some time, is the 820 North. We've went through numerous internal discussions on best how we can provide a process to the council that those could be comfortable, community on the council could be comfortable with, that we could move forward on resolving some of the concerns with that. The third item, I think big one, is some of the east-west connectivity in the city, specifically 6th South, maybe 9th South and 5th North specifically. Some of our recommendations we're showing this evening as provided to the council in the current update is to try to resolve that through additional studies. And I think the last one is, and it may not specifically be addressed, but we've had discussion with the council on maybe how to address that, and that is starting a process or a planning process to start reducing less auto-centric focus. And so I think those are the four, if we're working with the council, that we've kind of identified as some of those major concerns and comments that we've had. What we provided to you is our recommendation on changes to the current draft plan, and that we feel that we've worked through and feel like accommodate some of the majority of the council's concerns and how we can address those concerns moving forward. And so what we are looking at this evening is on the adoption of this plan with the current master plan with these changes, these identified changes, and I turn the time back to you to see if there's any other additional questions or concerns that we may have at this time.
All right, any questions for Shane before opening up for public comment? All right, I will open it up for public comment. I see two call-ins. If I can give him a minute here. Yes, phone number ending in 1882. Go ahead.
Hi, I am a resident of 2200 North, and
please state your name.
Daniel Jensen, and I just wanted to make a comment that I think sometimes in this process there's been kind of a air of inevitability about the expansion on 2230, and I think it seems like the city would do well to also make studying improvements on University Parkway's east-west connection between 9th East and University Avenue, and how that is a possible alternative to doing more to improve capacity on 2230. I know that probably similar comments have been aired in other venues, but wanted to reiterate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. Any other public comment? All right. We'll bring it back to the council for discussion. Any discussion from the council? Maybe Shane's reiteration of how many meetings this has gone through already has overwhelmed us. Ms. Ellsworth, yes.
Yeah, I know this has been an arduous task, and it's been ongoing for a year, I think. I still have concerns about Southeast Provo and the overall connectivity. If those won't be addressed in this plan, what other recourses do we have to improve and plan for connectivity in Southeast Provo?
I think that goes back. So in our suggestions is one of the things, and I think Shannon, Ms. Ellsworth, you'd mentioned a few, like you said, 9th South and some of those things. One of the things that we're looking in our recommendation is a Provo travel demand modeling study. And so we would look at specifically those areas of concern that have been brought to our attention, not only from the council, but from others. I think Mr. Harding has, requested, similar with 6th South, some connectivity recommendation or discussion about from 9th West over to 5th West or 2nd West. So that's another one. Again, you mentioned 9th South. I know 5th North has been brought up a bunch of times as well, to provide connectivity from Independence across over to Geneva Road. I think our recommendation, again, would be what is in here is that we look at these in further detail in that travel demand model, so that we can provide better information to you on what that means, what kind of demand would be in place if we made that connectivity, what kind of overall impact that would have, either positive or negative, on other facilities. So that's our recommendation, is to look at it in further detail from here to the next, between now and the next master plan update, which is in roughly 5 years. I think needs a little bit more in-depth study on that.
And will this plan dictate which, trying to remember the terminology, which roadway we build? Like the different profiles? Because I remember, a year ago, the city was looking at different road profiles and kind of narrowing some roads or giving different flexibilities. Is this set in stone, or could some of these new roads be different than what's proposed in this plan?
And I think we've always stated that these are general terms when we talk 3-lane, 5-lane, 2-lane. These are very general terms. So absolutely, we would focus on the phase 1. Phase 2, as those are out in the longer range plan, those are not necessarily our focus and our priority. Our priority are the phase 1 projects. And as we move forward with those phase 1 projects, as we've always said, absolutely, we look at it in the context of the area and what that means, not only from the auto focus, but also the active transportation focus. We've tried to include so that those kind of line up together, so as we move forward, that we're not just saying, okay, that it needs to be this exact with those things, but more of a context sensitive solution. Absolutely, those are discussions as we move forward on implementing the design and move forward on those projects. Those will be presented not only to the council, but the TMAC committee, planning commission, and they will have their input on what that is and what that looks like.
Mr. Hoban, you might be muted.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I had to unmute. I know I said this in the work meeting, but just wanted to say good job and thank you to Shane Winters and the engineering team for the amount of effort they put into this and the patience they've shown, and just being willing to take feedback and considerations. And as you're all aware, because I was harping on it for a while, I had some issues with the $70 million line item, and just wanting more data and more information around that before we committed to that or even put it on paper. And I just appreciate taking that into consideration. And, you know, personally, I think this plan will never be perfect. It should be reviewed and basically just provide some guidance. So I think I'm at the point where I'm comfortable supporting this, and you know, we're required by law, of course, to have one of these, and so I think given the time that's been put into it, I think it's time to approve it, and knowing that it will, you know, constantly be adjusted and adapted over time, that we'll have a chance to look at it again in 5 years, but at least it will serve as kind of a working document for us. So I'm at the point where I'm ready to say, let's move forward with it, and then we'll continue to review the general plan, which will then provide even more input for this the next time we go through this, and also we'll have a lot more information from some of those transportation studies from UDOT and such. So, but again, thank you to the engineering team for the hard work on this.
Thank you.
Any other comment from the council? Thought I saw another hand up, but I guess not.
And I do want to reiterate, you know, every year we go through the budgeting process, and I think in engineering we try to provide you, as we budget these projects, the transportation projects, we want to be give you as much information as what we're doing and what, you know, costs are involved as we do it. But this document here, I think, gives us a good plan that guides us, that as we present that to you and every year at the annual budget, that you understand kind of where things are at. So again, I appreciate the council and the feedback again.
Thank you, Shane. And I'll just say I also appreciate the flexibility and the openness to future conversations that I think we need to have as a city about our general plan that might reflect back on this transportation plan, hopefully in some positive ways. So I appreciate your flexibility and excellent work on this with everyone involved, the community and staff and with us. So we thank you. Okay, so let's see. I think we took public comment. We're back in the discussion. Is there? This is an implied motion. So is there any further discussion on the council before I call for a vote? Mr. Harding.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm clear on what the implied motion is for. Does the implied motion include the changes that we've been looking at?
So I would say that what we're looking for is the adoption of the draft plan that's been presented to you with the inclusion of these changes that have been provided to you.
And so I guess I'm looking to Mr. Jones if he can advise us if that is what is actually before us at the moment, so we can make sure that we're approving the right thing.
Sorry. Okay, so I was actually just on the phone with Mr. Magnus. I think about the same issue, but just to make sure I'm on the same page, ask me the question again.
Okay, I'm just asking for some clarification on what the implied motion applies to.
Yeah, that's what Mr. Magnus and I were just talking about. I think the implied motion actually applies to a document that does not reflect the changes that were just discussed. So my proposal would be that someone make a motion to amend the ordinance to refer to an Exhibit A. And then what we'll do, what Mr. Magnus and I will do is create an Exhibit an Exhibit A after the fact that has the web or the link to the updated plan, as long as we all are on the same page about what the updated plan is.
All right, well, I will move that we update the implied motion to include an amendment A, which will, I tried to follow, but still don't know how to word that.
Yeah, let me real quick try to actually amend the ordinance so that you can see what you're doing. So
that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Give me just 1 second.
While you're working on that, let me just echo some of the thoughts that I shared in the work meeting, and have been already shared a little bit in this evening meeting. But I wanted to thank the engineering department, Mr. Winters in particular, for the flexibility and the very quick accommodations that you made for the concerns that the council brought up. I appreciate just that interaction that we had where you were able to help us understand some of these transportation principles, and we were able to discuss what we were trying to accomplish. And I do think we ended up with at a good place to move forward.
Okay, so if we could have Mr. Magnus bring up the most recent revision that I just made. And then, Mr. Harding, I'm sending you a proposed language for the motion in the chat.
All right. So I would like to move to amend the ordinance to refer to Exhibit A and to attach Exhibit A, the amended master plan as discussed.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? If not, I'll call for a vote, and I'll begin with Mr. Hoban.
Yes.
Mr. Harding.
Yes.
Mr. Shipley.
Yes.
Mr. Fillmore. Say that again, Mr. Fillmore, you were muted. I unmuted you. Oh.
No, I'm not muted, I don't believe.
Well, I unmuted you but just now, so I have that much power.
Thank you for flexing your political muscle there. Yes, I vote yes.
Okay, I lost track of where I was. Mr. Shipley, did you vote?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Okay. Ms. Ellsworth
Yes.
and Mr. Sewell.
Yes.
Is that everybody? I apologize. The thing got all mixed up as we were talking, and I vote yes. So that is a unanimous vote. Thank you, everyone. And again, thank you, Mr. Winters. Okay, we'll move on to items number 5 and number 6. Obviously, they're separate items related. Item number 5 is an implied motion on an ordinance amending Provo City Code regarding beer licenses and regulations to streamline it and bring it into alignment with state regulations. And this will be presented by Brian Jones.
Thank you, Chair Hanley. So as you can see on the screen, this particular ordinance was something that came to you from the Alcohol Licensing Committee. But to be clear for members of the public, this particular ordinance doesn't have anything to do with the brew pub proposal. It's a byproduct of that, in the sense that while the Alcohol Licensing Committee was discussing brew pub issues, it was recognized that there were a number of places in our current city code where what we have in the code either conflicts with state code, where that is inappropriate, or is duplicative of state or county code. So one of the things that the Alcohol Licensing Committee did was to review the entire beer license chapter and propose the amendments that you see in front of you, which sole purpose is to streamline the code and to remove those redundancies and to reorganize the chapter into a more readable and more consistent format. but not to make any policy changes regarding beer licensing and regulation. I'm happy to walk through exactly what those changes are if necessary, but we did talk about this at the work session. So unless that's desired, I'll just answer any questions.
I think we can just have you answer questions. And so I'll call on the council if they have any questions for you. All right. We'll open it up for public comment. I see one call-in listener. I don't know. I'll wait a moment. All right. Have I waited long enough, Mr. Strachan?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. I'll bring it back to the council for discussion. Any discussion on this item? Mr. Harding.
Yeah, let me just say, I think this is just a good proposal. I think it will make it easier for our business owners to understand the few differences that Provo has that's in addition to state and county, but clears out a lot of the conflicting and redundant information. So those actual differences are much easier to be aware of and to comply with. So I think all around this is a good proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Harding. Other comments? All right, seeing none, I will call for a vote on the implied motion. So I'll call for a verbal yes or no. Mr. Sewell?
Yes.
Mr. Fillmore? Sorry, one more time, Mr. Fillmore.
Yes.
Mr. Harding?
Yes.
Mr. Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Hoban?
Yes.
Ms. Ellsworth?
Yes.
And I will vote yes. So that voting is unanimous. We'll move on to item number 6, which is also an implied motion on an ordinance amending Provo City Code regarding beer licenses and regulations to create a Class F beer license for restaurants with ancillary breweries, and this will also be presented by Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Chair Hanley and members of the council. So this one is, as shown by the title, this one is directly related to the previous land use action that was taken regarding brew pubs in certain downtown zones. What this would propose to do is to add a new section to Chapter 6.14, which creates a Class F beer license that entitles the licensee to brew beer on the premises of a restaurant and to sell that beer for consumption only on the premises of that restaurant. In order to get such a license, they would need to meet all the requirements of state code in order to brew and sell beer. And then there are a number of places throughout the rest of the title where that Class F license is cross-referenced, meaning where there are specific requirements that apply to Class B licenses, which are restaurants that already exist. Those restrictions would also apply to Class F licenses. So as far as what it does, the ordinance is very simple. It just creates that license and allows it to be obtained and adds cross references to that license throughout the chapter. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Jones. As mentioned, we discussed this earlier, but any additional questions for Mr. Jones? All right. Oh, Mr. Fillmore.
I suppose I could possibly wait until public comment, but I might as well just lay it out. My primary concern with the draft ordinance the way it is it has no limiting factors that we had previously discussed. That is, there's nothing in the proposed ordinance that has what we would call proximity or density limitations. And I think it's critical that that be addressed. My preference would be that that be addressed before its adoption, both for the public's sake as well as those who might wish to apply for a brew pub. They ought to know what they're getting into. We had talked in our work session about the possibility of, if we did draft the ordinance in its present status, we've authorized the subcommittee to address certain density limitations, and we could add tonight an effective date later in the year to allow time to refine the ordinance. So I just wanted to put that on the table at the beginning of our discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. All right, if there are no other questions or comments for Mr. Jones, let me request any public input. I'll give a moment here to see if anyone would like to make a comment. All right. If a hand goes up in the next 20 seconds, I'll revert back, but I don't see any public comment. So further discussion on the council. Mr. Hoban.
Yeah. So if I'm not mistaken, when I was doing my research on this before we voted to allow the land use, if that's what we call it, I can't remember. But there was a density limitation in the state statutes, or basically there was a certain number of licenses per capita. And so also we have limitations on how close a restaurant serving alcohol can be to schools and houses of worship and such. So we do have, if you were to, I think if we were to pull up a map, you know, of the downtown area, given that the temple's there and such, there would be some limitations on where, just naturally already in the state code, on where we could put brew pubs and such. Also, there are, as I mentioned, limitations already on per capita as well. So I think I'm inclined to support this, especially given the economic situation that we're going to find ourselves in the next 20 to 40 weeks as the city projects, you know, with a shortfall in sales tax revenue and things like that. That if in the next year or two we were to have a brew pub or a restaurant with ancillary brewing that were to open up, that could be a draw for people in the area to come and experience a new restaurant, a different style of restaurant. And so for me, I'm supportive of this, and I think we do have some density controls in place that at least the state found sufficient. And of course, you know, we don't follow the state in everything, but I think there are some catch-all or fallbacks that we have in place already. So I'm inclined to move forward with it.
Mr. Sewell.
Just a point of clarification. My recollection from reviewing state code was that there are distance requirements related to proximity to certain types of public facilities, like churches and schools and maybe parks. As far as a population density, I only recall seeing that for bars, and I don't believe there is a population-based limit for brew pubs or restaurants with that serve alcohol in the state code that I noticed anyway.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yep. Mr. Harding.
So I would like to vote. I'll be voting in favor of this proposal tonight. I do, if under ideal circumstances, I would like to more fully study and develop a proposal that would also look at other limitations, but because of the state law that says that anything we pass after tomorrow, if there is a referendum that's called, it wouldn't be able to be, we couldn't vote on it this fall. It would have to wait till next fall. And I don't think it's in the public interest to have this issue unresolved for that long. So I would like to vote on this today so that if there's enough support to have the public vote on it, it would be resolved this fall rather than in 18 months. I also, I would like the subcommittee to continue to look at best practices to see if we can come forward with a proposal that the council would support. But I do not support delaying the implementation of this F license in the meantime. I believe we have an interested party that would like to move forward with some plans to put a brew pub in downtown. We have not heard of any other interest, and if you just look at the number of brew pubs in other cities that already allow them, we have one in Lehigh, we have one in Spanish Fork, or Springville, I apologize. And so I don't think it's likely that we'll get any more than one application. I think that we can move forward this way, and then just in the future take a look at if the subcommittee can again propose something that the whole council will support. So just recap, I would like to I will be voting for this tonight, and I would not support a delay in the implementation.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore.
I'm not opposed to Mr. Harding's timing issue in the sense of voting tonight, so that if there's going to be a referendum that happens this year. My concern is only that I don't think it needs to be made effective immediately. I would like to see us do additional work on refining the ordinance with respect to density limitations, so that people know what they're voting on if there's going to be a referendum vote. Otherwise, we've got this fairly generic ordinance without the kind of density limitations that I think a good many of us would like to see. Secondly, we discussed earlier today, we've got a potential legal problem. And that is that if someone files an application for a brew pub before we refine the ordinance with density conditions, they may acquire rights that would be independent of any limitations we put on the ordinance eventually. I think that would be a major mistake on our part. It doesn't really hurt anyone to defer the effective date, particularly because any applicant is going to have to go through a major licensing process with both the federal government and the state government in the interim. And so I don't think there's a rush necessarily to force the effective date immediately. I think there's ample time for the process to play out and to allow the voters to have more facts in front of them when they do cast a ballot, if it's going to happen this fall. So I would propose an effective date to January 1st.
Can I ask a question about that date, Mr. Fillmore, or this is actually for the whole council, but I like your reasoning, but I'm wondering about January 1st date. I know you mentioned earlier today waiting until after the election. On the other hand, having it all set before the vote happens, which we don't even know if it's going to happen. Of course, the referendum still hasn't been formally ratified. So, but assuming it does get ratified, if we had an effective date of August 1st or September 1st, which seems like it's not, I don't know, January just feels an awfully long ways away, keeping everything in limbo for much longer than would be necessary for us to draft the remaining portions of the density questions, for example. That seems to be a matter of a month or two. It seems quite reasonable that we could have something done by mid or late summer.
Well, I don't doubt we could have something done. I'm just addressing the logic that there's no sense in making it more effective until after the election date. If that's going to happen, we don't know yet, but we might as well make the effective date sometime after early November. I don't know that a couple of months makes that much difference.
Mr. Jones, you have a comment?
I was just going to make a comment on that. One thing to think about with the proposed referendum is that if someone applies, okay, back up. If this passes tonight, and if someone comes in and applies for a referendum, and if the signatures are gathered, that puts the ordinance into a state of pause until after the election anyway. So in terms of what you were just talking about, one thing you could do is you could say, let's say you picked an effective date of August 1st. If the referendum is actually going to take place, it won't go into effect until after the election anyway. But if the referendum isn't going to take place, then it would become effective on August 1st.
That clarifies it for me. It seems to me that the question of the referendum can settle itself, and if it passes, if they get the signatures and it goes into effect, then as you're saying, whatever we would decide is going to be put on hold in any case. So I'd be more comfortable with an effective date regarding this license that includes resolution on density questions. I would prefer a date that's sooner than later. I mean, within reasonable amount of time. So I think something like August 1st feels good to me. Mr. Harding.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Jones, for that clarification. I do think that may have been missing from our conversation earlier, our discussion earlier. If I understood that, if there's enough signatures to make it go onto the ballot, then it doesn't matter whether or not we have an effective date, because the effectiveness will be on hold until that election takes place. I think Mr. McGinn was very clear earlier that they would not issue any licenses before the question of whether or not there's enough support for a referendum would take place. So, if it's going to end up on the ballot, there's no way that this is going to be effective before the people have a chance to vote on it. And if it's not going to have enough support to go to the ballot, I guess I don't see any. Help me understand why we would want to delay the implementation with the understanding of that it won't go into implementation until the people have a chance to vote on it, if it has enough support for that.
Well, in my mind, based on what I've heard other councilors express, the one reason for doing so would be if there isn't going to be a referendum, but there is still a concern about somebody coming in and applying for a license before the regulations are passed.
Mr. Fillmore.
Yeah, I think Mr. Jones' explanation on the legal consequences is convincing. And so I'd be happy to compromise to a later effective date. Either my preference would be the end of August. But I think we simply have to deal with that gap potential and the legal problems that are created with the quasi-vesting situation of somebody applying before the ordinance is refined. Plus, if there is a referendum, that'll give people more context to vote on.
So I guess the question is, Mr. Fillmore, are you making a motion?
I guess I would like somebody else to make the motion to approve the ordinance, and I'll proffer an amendment.
Well, there's already a motion to approve the ordinance because there's an implied motion based on our rules. So I think if you would like to make a motion regarding the effective date, I would do that now and make a motion to amend the effective date of the proposed ordinance to whenever you want it to be.
Okay.
And if that passes, well, whether that passes or not, the next step would be to vote on the implied motion to approve the ordinance.
All right, then I will make a motion to make the effective date of this proposed ordinance August 30th to allow the council sufficient time to address the issue of density limitations.
All right, do I have let's see, I've got two hands up. I don't know if I need to call for a second. Are these comments or a second? Mr. Shipley, I'll just go to Mr. Shipley first.
Yeah, I just would like to hear from the committee on how far out we need to put the effective date, not just put an arbitrary date out. You know, I mean, if they need to review density and we're going to look at some things before this gets ratified or effective, I'd like to hear from them on how fast they think they can come up with some solutions on it. I don't think we should just come up with some arbitrary date.
Someone on the committee like to speak to that?
Mr. Strachan has his hand raised.
Oh, I don't see him. I'm sorry, Mr. Strachan, go ahead.
That's fine. Because I'm a co-host, I can't actually raise my hand on the device, so I have to kind of show my hand up. I think a couple things play into the timing. One is the administration will need time to actually put it into place. I think the fact that there's been a question referred back to the committee will require some extra time for the committee to work through some of those issues. That takes us at least to about July. And then I think the other factor that right now leads us to at least July is the stay home, stay safe mode that we're all in right now. Schools just got canceled to the rest of the school year, which takes us into June for most districts. So I don't think anything's going to happen much in terms of starting new business before the summer anyway. And then so that gives us time to review it. But the reality is going into between now and June, I think we're going to be focused on the budget. So giving us time to get through the summer at least is probably wise in terms of a timing on it. So, you know, I'd proposed before somewhere after, you know, September 1st or October 1st or January 1st. It is very arbitrary, but I think you're going to need a good couple of months to get through the budget and then allow yourself maybe a couple more months to get through any extra work on this item. That's just my suggestion.
Thank you, Mr. Strachan. Ms. Ellsworth.
Yeah, I think we have what's the word, the power and the desire to come to a solution quickly. But I think it's the details of the restrictions that will just require a lot of back and forth. And I think we'll have to be willing to iterate and put forward different proposals that will probably be denied. And I think I said this earlier, it's very much a trial and error, I think, because there's so many different permutations of how this could happen and different ways that the committee and then the council could vote. I think that we could come up with restrictions in the next, I don't know, maybe 2 months. And I don't want to speak for the fellow subcommittee members. But I think it's doable. Do I appreciate Cliff's input and that we have other things on our plate, especially with the budget? Yes. I think August is fine. It might be sooner. And if it was later, we can, you know, amend this, right?
Mr. Sewell.
I like that idea based on, you know, the end of August or 1st of September seems to give us plenty of time. And then if we can get it done sooner, just move the effective date earlier. Isn't that a possibility, Mr. Jones?
Certainly, it's a possibility. I don't see why not. My one concern is it might raise referendum issues because you're in essence amending the ordinance.
All right. Right.
So that might be a little bit tricky, but it's at least theoretically possible.
Okay.
Well, I would just say that I'm given this information, I'm comfortable with an August 30th deadline. At least it doesn't feel like it was pulled out of thin air at this point. It feels like I can see the rationale for that amount of time. Mr. Harding.
I guess, sorry, I started thinking about something else. So the way that I've been working with the other subcommittee members at looking at what an alcohol outlet density would look like, could look like, and I feel like what we're likely to end up with is something that is going to allow not the proposed, because it hasn't been proposed yet, but the potential brew pub that we've heard that there's interest in creating, that is going to be, looking at what we're looking at, it's going to be allowed if we move forward with what we're looking at. So I feel like all we really accomplish by delaying the implementation is we're putting off a local business who wants to expand in downtown. They could be taking advantage of the time where, the public's really not going to restaurants. They could use that kind of downtime to build their restaurant and assemble everything. And so just to delay it for extra months, I don't see really the benefit of that. And where in our work meeting we had a vote to move forward with the F license with no additional restrictions, and that had 3 votes. I voted against it because I do feel like there should be we should look at some additional restrictions in the future. But I think in the short interim, I think we should allow this local restaurant to move forward. And so, I mean, it seems to me that anyway. So for me, I guess I don't see any value and only downside to delaying the implementation. I think if we move forward and allow it right now, we're going to have 1 application, and we will have any additional restrictions worked out, before anything else comes in. So I think it's a low risk going forward and high reward by supporting a local business that would like to expand downtown.
Mr. Harding, if I could respond, I think there is a downside. We've kind of already talked about it. I know it's probably low risk. I think I agree with that, but I think just because there is a risk of not really addressing what for me is a pretty central question, and that is approving a brew pub is one thing, but suddenly facing the possibility where we have kind of a brew pub district or something like that in the city, I think would be going much farther than would be desirable. I don't say that because of animus toward the idea. I mean, I've made peace with the vote, and I want to be supportive of what's going forward. But I think if we don't have the clarity that the business owner himself or herself deserves to have in terms of where and where they're going to want to locate and so on, I think just the clarity needs to be there. The situation is what it is. I mean, I think if we didn't have this concern about April 15th, I suppose it wouldn't matter at all, and we would go ahead and take the needed time to do this. But anyway, for me, I'm inclined to want to support this with the implementation date put out a little bit farther so that we have time to address those other questions. Because I think standing alone, this F license doesn't address all the concerns that I think the community has, and that really I'm thinking this no longer as a wedge issue, but a compromise issue, a bridge building issue. I think to the degree that we're allowing it, and then we're going to allow it within certain kinds of parameters, I think that's a healthy compromise for the community. I think it preserves safety and the quality of Provo life that people are invested in, and it allows for in both senses. So anyway, I just think this seems like a reasonable time to wait. So Mr. Harding, I'm sure you want to respond. I see you want to respond, and then Mr. Shipley.
And that's perfectly reasonable what you just talked about. And if the motion gets a second, and if we vote on it, we'll see whether or not we want to move forward with an implementation date or without an implementation date. So I think we'll resolve that. The one thing I'm not clear on is if we do move forward without an implementation date, I guess I'm not seeing any type of restriction that we would put on that would jeopardize. If someone puts in an application, it's not going to jeopardize. It's not going to give them. They don't have a lack of clarity. If they get the license, then any additional restrictions to getting new licenses wouldn't apply to them. So I don't think that there's necessarily a clarity issue for someone that would apply in the short term.
Okay. Mr. Shipley.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a good answer to this, but I just want to make sure that this doesn't risk this Class F getting diluted to a point where we use the restrictions that we're trying to establish as an excuse to basically not allow brew pubs. And I know that's maybe that's not what anybody's thinking, but that's my skeptical mind at work here. If we delay this from an implementation standpoint to give us time to look at restrictions and density restrictions and other restrictions, are we just giving ourselves, opening the door to giving ourselves an excuse to basically not allow, for folks who want to do this? And we've told them we're moving, that direction. Are we just giving, folks a door opening to basically not allow brew pubs and not allow for, reasonable solutions?
Mr. Fillmore.
I think Mr. Shipley's concern really will be addressed by any referendum effort. What I'm focused on is an effective date to allow us to put appropriate conditions on a brew pub license. I want to be sure I understood what Mr. Harding said. If we were to pass this today with a later effective date on August 30th, and someone files an application next week or next month before we refine the F license, I want to be clear that anyone who ends up getting such a license, it would be subject to whatever refinements we make prior to that later effective date. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, because they wouldn't be able to get a license until after the effective date.
Good. I want to make sure if anyone does apply that they're put on notice that the ordinance is not fully settled yet. That there is a possibility that density restrictions would be imposed on it, that he would, or she, or it would be subject to, in fairness to them.
Yeah, and my recommendation to go forward without an implementation date would mean that anyone who received a license, understanding that they wouldn't as long as the referendum question was open, if they received a license, then any restrictions we're putting on it would not apply to people who already have licenses. It would only apply to new applications for licenses.
Yeah, that's why I think we have to have an effective date. I think we owe that to our citizens as well as the applicant.
So we did have a motion. I'm sorry that I maybe lost track a little bit. We had a motion for an effective date of August 30th. Bill Fillmore made that motion. So the motion being that we would approve the F license tonight with the stipulation that further questions related to density and other restrictions would be deliberated by the subcommittee and brought back to the council for later consideration, and that all of that would happen before the effective date of August 30th.
That's correct.
Am I getting that right?
Yes.
So do I have a second on that motion?
I'll second it.
Okay, Mr. Sewell seconds that. Any further discussion of that motion? Seeing none, I'll call for a vote on that motion. Mr. Sewell,
Yes.
Mr. Shipley,
No.
Mr. Harding,
No.
Mr. Fillmore,
Yes.
Mr. Hoban,
No.
Ms. Ellsworth,
No.
and I will vote yes. So that is 4 against and 3 in favor. The 3 in favor were Mr. Sewell, myself, George Handley, and Bill Fillmore. So help me out, Mr. Jones. Where does that put us?
So the substitute motion, or the motion to amend the ordinance to change the effective date, has failed. So now it's time to, unless there are further motions to be made, it's time to call for a vote on the implied motion to approve the ordinance as is with an immediate effective date. When I say immediate, it doesn't actually go into effect until after the 15 days that the mayor has to sign it, and it has been published and posted and met other regulations, but it goes into effect as soon as the steps to take.
Mr. Strachan.
It's my understanding that, as I said earlier, that realistically, it's going to be 2 to 3 months anyway before this actually becomes, I mean, it'll be effective immediately, but in practical effect, I think Gary McGinn said it would take a while to roll this out anyway. So you probably got 3 or 4 months ahead.
And I would also add to that if there's going to be a referendum, the sponsors only have 5 days to come forward and start that process. Mr. McGinn has assured us, and I think the administration would back this up, that if sponsors come forward and start the process, I don't believe that Mr. McGinn intends to issue any licenses until the signature gathering process has been finished anyway, because we wouldn't want to have issued a license and then have the ordinance not actually be valid.
So help me understand then. Sorry, I'm a little slow. So at what point would the referendum be done with the signatures?
About 2 months from now.
Okay, so nothing would happen until mid-June, presumably.
Unless nobody even came forward to start it within the next 5 days. If no sponsors even come forward and submit a referendum initiative and referendum petition within the next 5 days, then there will be no referendum.
Oh, the signature gathering period ends in 5 days?
The application to start gathering signatures ends in 5 days.
I did not realize that had not happened. Okay.
Well, it can't happen until after the ordinance has been passed. It happened. So let me back up. You're thinking about the land use ordinance. It did happen with regard to the land use ordinance. I'm talking about if it happens with regard to this ordinance that you're voting on tonight.
Okay.
So just to be clear, Brian, what's the status on any referendum effort on the zoning change from prior months?
I'd have to defer to, I don't know if Amanda can jump in and say, I don't remember what the deadline for the signatures was. I was thinking mid-May.
Written here, it's 7 days. I don't know if that's referring what that's referring to.
Oh, the 7 day. 7 days might be 7 days would be how long might be how long they have to come in and file the petition. But Mr. Fillmore's question about the referendum that's already in process, I don't know when the signature deadline for that is. I believe it's mid to late May.
Sure, I'd be happy to address that.
Thank
Their deadline to gather signatures is actually it will be April 30th. The 7 days is in reference to they'll have 7 days from the time this is passed to file the referendum, is my understanding.
On this ordinance.
Mr. Strachan, did you need to make a comment?
And I was just going to add, and it will have a lower threshold for signature gathering.
Why is that?
Just the
It's
way
not
the
a-
law is.
It's not a land use ordinance, so there's a different set of criteria.
Either way, I think the practical effect is that with the amendment failing, instead of having, in the absence of a referendum, instead of having 4 months to come up with the any extra policies or restrictions regarding the licensing, you probably have 2 to 3 months before Gary McGinn would be able to roll out any actual applications if there were some pending.
So I guess I'm, I just, all I wanted was a beer license with clear rules about location and density. It seemed to me that made a lot of sense to go together. And I have no intention of trying to put a stranglehold on this. I just want to meet the concerns of the community in a fair and clear way. So now I feel like the vote is requiring me or asking me to vote in favor of the license without those other considerations put in place, or at least at the risk that they won't get in place in time to apply to particular applications. But if I'm understanding what's being explained, the 2-month delay would give us 2 months anyway to pass additional density.
You'd have you'd have 2 more months to get it done if we were to start a little bit later, and if we were to, not necessarily put as much effort into it during the budget season. If you want to get it done without a different effective date, in practical terms, we probably can get it done by the end of June if the committee continues to want to meet and pursue it.
Is that a wish of the committee? I mean, I thought our earlier discussion this afternoon, we kind of indicated as a council that we were wanting that. I know that was a split vote, so I'm want to be sensitive to the division of opinion here, but I'm just asking for my own sake in voting on this. I mean, I would feel comfortable supporting it if I knew that we had sufficient time to pass additional parameters regarding density questions and related questions. Mr. Harding.
So I'm just one committee member, but I am highly motivated to propose to the rest of the council a best practice that's suggested by the CDC that I think will address the public safety and public health concerns that have been expressed. And I think we can do that. I mean, we rely on a lot of the great support of the administration, but I feel like we can move through that. We won't rush through it, but I think we can get it done in a reasonable amount of time within the 2 months that we're talking about.
If I could just interject, I see Ms. Ellsworth has her hand up, and I'll call on her in just a second. But I guess I want to say something somewhat political. I mean, this is a political meeting, so I'm going to say political things, I guess, every time I open my mouth. But for those of you who are in favor of the original brew pub vote, it seems to me it's in your interest, or in the interest of those who support it,
want to see some clarity on these questions because sooner than later. And the reason I say that is because there is a referendum that has been proposed. Now, whether or not it gets the signatures, I don't know. I've been doubtful that it will succeed in that regard, but I don't know for sure. But my point is that I think it's an effort of goodwill to say, we understand that there are legitimate questions about safety that pertain to this particular question of a brew pub, and so we'd like to do this in a way that shows that we're being responsible to those questions. We're answering those questions, even if people are going to disagree about exactly what those parameters ought to be in terms of density and so on. But to just dismiss it as sort of irrelevant to the question, I think only disregards the concerns of a pretty significant portion of our community that has those concerns. And so I think it's in the interest of coming together, not in the interest, like I say, of strangling the proposal for a brew pub, but to try to find some reasonable parameters that everybody can agree on. So that's my plea to my fellow council members for what it's worth. Ms. Ellsworth.
Yeah, I have some comments. I think that we can move this forward more quickly, or a little bit more quickly, in creating restrictions for brew pubs if we don't, in addition, cumber the subcommittee with also creating restrictions on the other licenses. So the subcommittee is going to get really in the weeds, and they're going to take a lot more time if they are also focusing on C licenses and B licenses and all the other licenses. So that's why we ought to narrow the scope over the next 2 or 3 months and say just focus on F licenses, because then we can move through this more quickly. And hopefully it's more quickly because there's still some disagreement in the subcommittee about whether the CDC regulations are really best practices for Provo, because the CDC regulations may not be for a town like Provo, where we have very few, considerably on average, fewer consumers of alcohol. And the CDC regulations are for the elimination or the decline of excessive alcohol consumption, of which I do not believe a brew pub exacerbates. I don't think a brew pub contributes to excessive alcohol consumption. So there is some disagreement on how we can move forward as a subcommittee, and that's what's going to bog us down the most, is on what kind of best practices we want to implement and how many other licenses we're going to reinvent while we're focusing or trying to focus on solutions for the Class F license.
Yeah, and I'd like to be on record that I'm not inclined to investigate all the other licenses. I think that's that's a bigger question, and I think actually I have a pretty high confidence that our state regulations are sufficient, that what we already have is sufficient in that regard. We're just adding a new kind of business to downtown to Provo generally, and to certain areas of the city. I just want to make sure that I don't know. I'm speaking for myself, but I didn't imagine that the parameters that we were going to be looking at were exhaustive and overly restrictive, but just reasonable, so that we avoided the possibility of kind of a cluster of brew pubs in a certain part of town or something like that. So I'm not inclined to want to tell the subcommittee that you ought to go tackle something that much of that's a huge hornet's nest that I think is probably better off left alone. If we can just tackle the F license question, I think I'd be satisfied. Mr. Harding.
So there's a lot to this, and I think we've kind of try to stay away from some of these details. In part, these are the details that I feel like need to be worked out so that we can bring a coherent and strong proposal to the council. The CDC papers, and I can send them to all the councilors if they want to delve into this issue. But it talks about alcohol outlet density, and it explicitly talks about restaurants that sell beer, brew pubs, as well as bars. It says people that sell beer for on-premise consumption, and in parentheses it has those three items, or those three types of outlets. And so it is, to me, clear that when the CDC makes these recommendations, it is referring to all three of these establishments. And I feel if we are going to be looking at a density, it matters what else is in the vicinity. So I think you do need to consider, where are the bars, and how that should play into the outlet density. And so to me, it makes no sense to not consider all the outlet density. The way that we're looking, the way that we're leaning towards it, as Mr. Sewell talked about earlier, has to do with kind of a gravity, consider kind of a gravity-based model. Or another way to look at it is it's kind of like a heat map. And so the way that we're considering, or just starting to explore this would not restrict, two restaurants from situating next to each other, or even two brew pubs situating next to each other. It wouldn't exclude that explicitly, because if there's nothing else around it, then that's not really a clustering of alcohol outlets. But if you start to get kind of a district, or a bar and a couple of brew pubs, as well as restaurants that sell alcohol, all congregating in one area, there may be a threshold that the council puts in and says, we can't get too dense of these outlets. And so I do think that the CDC gives us some good framework to use. Obviously, it will be up to us to determine what the right threshold is. How dense is too dense. I think we can move through that quickly, but to me, there's no point in saying we're not going to consider bars, we're not going to consider restaurants that sell alcohol, we're only going to consider brew pubs. I mean, it's to me, that's almost meaningless. So,
Mr. Harding, can I ask for a clarification on this?
Yes, please.
Because what you're saying is very persuasive to me, but I understood what Ms. Ellsworth was talking about was that, I mean, where we place these brew pubs should be considering where other alcohol outlets are. I agree with that. But I assume that's still a Class F license question. It's not, because it doesn't pertain to having to go back and revise all of those other licenses, does it? I mean, why is that? Why isn't that just a matter of deciding what are the parameters for a Class F license? Okay,
and very, very good question. So the flip side of that is right now, bars are not allowed in the zones that we allow F licenses, but there are zones where bars are allowed in Provo. And so is there a point at which we would say, we're not going to allow another bar here because we have too much of a concentration there? Is there ever a point in which we would say to a restaurant, you can locate there, but we will not give you a B license for you to operate, for you to sell beer if you locate there, because of the density of other outlets that's in that area. And if the council and if we lay this out as a committee, if we make a presentation and the council says, you know what, there's no limit, there's no concentration of restaurants that would get to the point where we would be willing to say no to a new B license, then we would just work that into the proposal. But there may be a point when we would say, you know what, even if whatever your favorite chain restaurant is, if they wanted a B license, but in this area it's just too concentrated, if there is a threshold where we think it's there, then the CDC suggests that it's good practice to have a limit. So I think, but yeah, thank you. I didn't explain that part of it, and there's a whole lot that there's a lot to be had here, which is why I think it will, we're not ready to propose something now, but I think we can have a coherent, elegant density outlet that is in alignment with what the CDC recommends. But I didn't want to take all of the time that I've taken already, and we haven't explored everything. So give us the chance to work some of this out. Otherwise, I think if we treat F license all by itself, then we're missing most of the picture, and it won't. Again, I would be surprised if we have even more than one application in the next 3 years. So, that's why I'm asking, or why I was supportive of the vote that we took earlier, that the subcommittee will take a look at alcohol outlet density, and I do think we can get back to the to the council soon with some recommendations.
All right, thank you, Ms. Ellsworth, and then Mr. Strachan.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was in our subcommittee meeting or in a council meeting where I brought up City Creek Mall, and they allow, I think, 5 or 6 different establishments and restaurants just in, 2 city blocks in Salt Lake. And so I think that's a model that we should emulate. I think it's a really great model. It drives a lot of retail, it drives a lot of sales. It's a high-end establishment. They haven't prohibited the Cheesecake Factory and the Texas de Brazil Steakhouse from serving alcohol or being within proximity of each other. And that's all owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I think we should be more flexible and especially flexible with business owners and especially restaurants at this time. Why would we ever add more restrictions to restaurants right now?
Mr. Hoban.
So spirit goes to bed at midnight and common sense goes to bed about 8:30 when it's a council meeting. Is there some way I can call a vote and we can move forward and just vote on this one way or the other? I don't know. Do I call a vote?
Yes, you can.
Okay, I'd like to call a vote on.
Okay, so the technical procedure to do that is to make a motion to end debate, which requires a second, and then you have to vote on the motion to end debate.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Okay, I'll make a motion to end debate.
And I'll second that.
Can I, George, I've got my hand raised. Can I make one more comment?
Yes.
Well, actually, no. Under the rules of parliamentary procedure, once that motion has been made and seconded, it has to be voted on immediately.
Yeah, I can't make the obvious comment that Provo is not Salt Lake City. The brew pubs are not your standard restaurants.
You just did.
Well, you just did.
I did.
That was Brian, is the motion debatable?
No.
Okay. So the motion is to cease debate and call for a vote. So all in favor, Mr. Sewell?
No.
Mr. Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Harding?
I don't think it matters, but yes.
Mr. Fillmore?
No.
Mr. Hoban?
Yes.
Ms. Ellsworth?
Yes.
And I vote yes. All right, so we're going to end the debate and discussion. Now we're going to call for a vote on, sorry, Mr. Strachan, do you want to make a comment or clarification?
Yeah, Brian, can I, procedurally, can I make a comment? Because now we're at a point where we're voting on the original implied motion. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And in terms of framing it, a few weeks ago, a month or two ago, you passed a land use ordinance that allowed essentially what you're promoting in a Class F beer license. And if you choose not to pass this, then you ultimately essentially potentially delay any future issuance of a Class F license until next year if there's a referendum. And whatever flaws, such as not knowing, exactly the proximity and things like that, you'll have time between now and then to work it out. But there are some of you that are opposed to this no matter what, and there are some of you who are in favor no matter what. And I think just in terms of framing the discussion, whatever you decide on this next vote is either going to take a long time to resolve or is going to resolve itself fairly quickly. That's how I would frame that discussion. As your staff will do whatever you want us to do, and I just wanted to frame that for you.
Mr. Sewell?
I have a question of parliamentary procedure. I think this is the first time I've seen this invoked since I've been here. And if I'm understanding it right, I believe this cuts off our normal right to explain why we voted the way that we did. Is that correct? Or why we're going to vote? Normally each counselor has that right. And does cutting off debate prevent us from doing that?
My understanding of the rules is that it does require the vote to be taken immediately. There's probably nothing that prevents you at the pleasure of the other council members to going around the table and explaining your vote after the vote has taken place. But I think that the vote needs to be held immediately.
All right. I'm still wanting time to think, but I don't have that. So I guess we'll call for a vote. Ms. Ellsworth, did you have a comment? No?
I do, but I can save it till after the vote.
All right, Mr. Sewell.
No.
Mr. Shipley.
Yes.
Mr. Harding.
Yes.
Mr. Hoban.
Yes.
Mr. Fillmore.
No.
Ms. Ellsworth.
Yes.
And I'll vote no. So that's 4-3 in favor, with Mr. Sewell, Mr. Handley, and Mr. Fillmore voting against. And so we have approved the F license, and it is understood, right, as a result of this afternoon's discussion and vote, that the subcommittee still will look at considerations regarding density, outlet density, and related matters, correct? Ms. Ellsworth.
Yeah, I was wondering if we should in some way revise the alcohol licensing subcommittee. I know it was not favorable before to include the entire council, but I wonder if that's appropriate where there's so many diverse opinions. Is there another model that we can pursue that includes more council members?
Mr. Strachan.
Really, the only other way is to have any future discussion on it at a work meeting.
Just to sort of hammer out the questions of density in work session over time.
Yeah, the advantage of a committee is that you can work through it quicker, and hopefully, if you get the two diverging sides together, like we did this committee has done so far, you can bring it back with a recommendation to move forward. And along the way, you can have that input. It just moves faster. But if you want to just have it become an item on the council meeting or a special retreat for it or something like that, we could do it in that environment.
Frankly, I'm not confident that it would be any faster at this point. I think because every time this comes up, it's a pretty protracted conversation, and it's after the result of many hours that the subcommittee has already spent on it. I mean, initially, I liked the idea of a subcommittee working on this for that very reason, that I thought it could be more efficient. But maybe if we consider the fact that we've made a fair amount of progress thus far on the issues related to this, that it wouldn't be. I'm thinking out loud here, but it seems to me possible that we could make progress on this. I know our meetings have been quite full lately, but maybe that will change. Ms. Ellsworth, you have a comment?
Yes, I was going to agree with you. I don't really think the subcommittee has been very efficient. It's been about 3 months-ish, and all we've accomplished is a very simple line item that creates an F license, and that's what we just barely completed. Other than that, we streamlined other alcohol licenses. So we really haven't moved the needle on what we voted on back in January. We really haven't created any kind of shape or restrictions or vision for brew pubs at all. So I think we should include the rest of the council, and if it takes just as much time as with the committee, I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, with the forbearance of the council, let us staff work with council leadership and work on a schedule and timing to try and get information and bring that back.
Okay, Mr. Harding.
Unless I'm off, I believe the subcommittee was created 1 month and 3 days ago. And we have now passed a streamline of the beer licenses ordinance, and we've now created an F license, and we have a framework, being put together of what some alcohol outlet density could look like, and we've done a lot of research into the CDC publications and whatnot. I think we've actually accomplished a whole lot, and there have been a few times where we canceled committee meetings just because we felt like we were so far ahead and we just needed to wait till we could present to the council. I think we're being extremely efficient and can continue to do so if the council so desires.
And procedurally, I guess the one comment is that the committee has been created by motion of the council, has been given a mandate, and there was a motion in the work session today assigning to the committee the work of working on the alcohol outlet density question. So if there's a change to that now, and that's going to be debated by that's going to be addressed by the entire council instead of the committee, I think that would require a motion.
Okay, Mr. Hoban.
I was just gonna, well, I guess it's all changed. I was just gonna say I support, if somebody on the committee feels like they need, that we need more input, I don't see a negative with that. But it sounds like somebody has to make a motion on that. But just in general, I'm supportive of expanding the committee if we need to. I mean, if I were on a committee and I felt like, maybe the three of us that were on it weren't really getting to some consensus or something, I would probably want more help or more thought or more opinions. And I don't know, sometimes more is less, but in this case, maybe more is more.
We just had an aftershock up here.
You mean our vote or an earthquake?
No, I think it's an earthquake aftershock. My whole house just shook.
Oh boy.
Mr. Sully, it was walking someone down the hallway.
Your hand is up. I'm going to call on you anyway because you're the only member of the subcommittee who hasn't spoken to this issue of whether you want to continue as such or whether you would like it to come back to the committee of the whole.
Well, I'd like to continue unless there's a vote by the majority of the council to instruct us otherwise. But I was just going to raise another point of parliamentary procedure. Unless there's something in our handbook that states differently, a motion to call the question and close debate requires a 2/3 majority. I think we actually did have that in this case, but I just wanted to make sure that we were aware of that in case we feel like we need to do that again.
Thank you. I was ignorant of that rule, so I apologize for not being more aware. Mr. Shipley.
I know we've got really busy upcoming weeks with budget items and such, but would it be too much to ask to maybe, as part of our work meeting next week, spend 45 minutes to an hour as a group helping talk through some of the potential restriction? I feel like we had a couple different ideas a few weeks back. Don't feel like we had enough time to really flesh them out and get consensus on which direction the subcommittee should go. So I'd really appreciate the opportunity as a group to discuss that, give some direction, and then have the subcommittee take it from there.
Mr. Strachan, what is our sense of next week's work session?
It's probably pretty full as well, but let's talk about it at leadership and see what we can frame. Otherwise, let's put it off till May, because we only have 1 week to prepare from this point for the next meeting. And we've got, I think, 3 weeks till the May meeting, or no, 2 weeks after that till May. So we got 3 weeks to prepare for the May 4th meeting.
Mr. Harding.
I'm happy to have that discussion next week if we can fit it in. I also feel like I can share, or the committee or Ms. Salzal can share with the rest of the committee, some of the documents we've been looking at. I think we're fully open to suggestions from the rest of the council. I just think to move something forward quickly, we do rely a lot on Mr. McGinn and others that are supporting the committee. I think to move quickly, a subcommittee can move it forward more quickly, but happy to share whatever we're discussing and take any input from the rest of the council to help us move that forward as quickly as possible.
Cliff, real quick, and then Mr. Sewell.
Yep, I've just been informed that as of the moment, we have a very light agenda for next week, so we could probably give you 30 to 60 minutes. I'll promise 30, but we'll see what we can put together for next week.
Okay. Mr. Sewell.
Oh, I was just going to say, given the concerns that have been raised about the committee, I actually think Councilor Shipley's suggestion is a good one. I would actually prefer not to meet again until we feel like we have support from the majority of the council for what we're trying to accomplish.
All right. Sounds like we're coming to a consensus, and maybe we don't need to vote on anything at this point, except to say that we have had the suggestion of putting this on a work meeting next week. If you as a council would give us as leadership time to talk about this a little bit further, talk with staff and see what seems reasonable. And then when we meet next week, we can spend some time talking as a council as a whole to try to give you guys some direction. And if we can't come to at that point, I think we might have some clarity on whether or not this is something we could do as a whole, or whether we can continue to have you work as a subcommittee. Does that sound okay to everybody? That's great, because it's 9:01 and my goal is to finish by 9 at the latest. So I think we're done unless there are any other concerns, but I think we're right. The item number 7 has been continued. So if there is no further, no objection, councilors will want to turn on your mic and speak up. If you object, we will now adjourn the Provo Municipal Council meeting by unanimous consent. Thank you, everybody, for your time this evening on handling so many challenging and important issues. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.